What if aliens don't look strange at all, but look almost exactly like us? The Nordic aliens are described as tall, human-like beings with advanced intelligence and mysterious origins. For decades, witnesses have claimed encounters with these entities, often reporting the same appearance, behavior, and message. Some theories suggest the Nordics aren't visiting Earth anymore, because they're already here, living among humanity unnoticed. But why do similar stories appear across different countries and decades? In this video, we explore the top 10 proofs of Nordic aliens among us and the mystery behind one of the most talked about extraterrestrial races ever reported. There is a category of encounter so specific, so consistent across cultures and continents and centuries, that dismissing it as mass delusion requires more intellectual effort than simply taking it seriously. It is not the gray-skinned, black-eyed entity that dominates modern popular culture. It is not the reptilian shapeshifter of conspiracy lore. It is something far older in the human record, far more human-like in form, and, by the accounts of those who say they have encountered them, far more deliberate in its purpose. We are talking about beings described in nearly identical terms by a Norwegian fisherman in 1952, a Swiss farmer in 1975, a Brazilian security guard in 1996, and a Russian Air Force officer in 2009, tall, fair-skinned, blonde or platinum-haired, blue or violet-eyed. Built like idealized human beings, but slightly outside the range of normal human variation in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. They speak, they communicate, they carry messages, they warn, they observe, they intervene, and then they vanish, leaving behind only testimony, physiological effects, burned ground, and in some cases, documentation that governments have spent decades trying to suppress. These are the beings that researchers in the field of ufology have come to call the Nordics. The name is imprecise, borrowed from racial typology of the early 20th century, and it carries uncomfortable connotations that the field has largely moved past. But the name stuck because the description kept repeating. Beings who, if they walked through the streets of Stockholm or Oslo or Helsinki, would attract attention only for being slightly too perfect, slightly too tall, slightly too calm. Not monsters, not the alien of nightmares. Something far stranger than that. Something that looks almost exactly like us. The question this documentary sets out to answer is not whether you believe in aliens. That is the wrong question, and it has been the wrong question for 70 years. The right question is this. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, across historical periods separated by centuries, across witness accounts gathered independently by researchers who never compared notes, why does the same description keep appearing? Why do ancient Vedic texts describe beings called the Devas in terms almost identical to what 20th century contactees reported? Why did the Norse people build an entire cosmology around golden-haired beings from beyond the sky? Why do the declassified files of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the defense ministries of at least 6 other nations contain descriptions of human-appearing beings that don't match any known human population? And why, in a culture saturated with gray alien imagery, in films, in television, in merchandise, in internet memes, do genuine encounter reports continue to describe something entirely different? This is the case for the Nordic extraterrestrial hypothesis, not a belief system, not a religion, a case built from historical documentation, declassified government records, physical trace evidence, biological anomalies, genetic data, witness testimony from credible professionals, and a pattern of consistency that spans the entirety of recorded human history. We will examine 10 categories of evidence, 10 proofs, each one compelling on its own, devastating in aggregate. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads, and we will not flinch from what it suggests. Before we begin the proofs themselves, it is necessary to establish the baseline. Who or what are the Nordics? Where does the modern conception of them come from? How do researchers distinguish genuine Nordic encounter reports from culturally contaminated accounts? And how does this phenomenon fit into the broader landscape of what governments and scientific institutions have slowly, grudgingly begun to acknowledge as a genuine mystery? The modern era of Nordic alien encounters is generally dated to the early 1950s, though as we will see, the phenomenon has much deeper roots. In November 1952, a Polish-American amateur astronomer and author named George Adamski claimed to have made contact with a being from Venus near Desert Center, California. Adamski's account, which we will examine in detail in Part 2, described a being of extraordinary physical beauty, tall, fair, with long blonde hair and eyes of a greenish-gray color, wearing a one-piece reddish-brown suit. The being communicated through a combination of speech, gesture, and what Adamski described as direct mental impression. The meeting was brief, the message was urgent, and the encounter left 6 witnesses willing to sign sworn affidavits that something extraordinary had occurred in the California desert that afternoon. Adamski was the first of a wave. Within 3 years, dozens of individuals across North America, South America, and Europe were reporting near-identical encounters with tall, blonde, human-appearing beings who arrived in craft of various descriptions, communicated warnings about nuclear weapons and human aggression, and departed leaving behind nothing more than ground traces and a shaken witness. The sheer volume of these reports and their geographic spread should have constituted a scientific dataset worthy of serious study. Instead, the cultural gatekeepers of the 1950s, an era deeply committed to rationalist materialism and the ideology of scientific progress, dismissed the entire phenomenon as fantasy, fraud, and the projection of Cold War anxieties onto the sky. That dismissal, however, could not hold, because the reports kept coming, and they kept describing the same thing. By the 1970s, the UFO research community had developed a rough taxonomy of alien encounter types. The gray aliens, small, large-headed, black-eyed, associated with medical examinations and apparent abductions, dominated one category. The reptilians occupied another, more contested space. And then there were the Nordics, consistently reported as the most benevolent, the most communicative, and in many ways the most disturbing, because their near-human appearance made them simultaneously more relatable and more threatening. A being that looks like a human but isn't is, in the psychological literature, a textbook trigger for what researchers call the uncanny valley effect. Something deeply wrong registers in the brain even before the conscious mind can articulate what it is seeing. Witnesses who encounter Nordics frequently report this sensation, a profound unease beneath the surface of what appears to be an entirely normal human interaction. The physical description across thousands of reports is remarkably stable. Height ranging from 5 feet 10 inches to 7 feet, with the majority clustered around 6 feet 2 to 6 feet 4, outside the normal range for human males, but not impossibly so. Skin tone described as very fair, sometimes almost luminescent, sometimes described as slightly golden or having a faint metallic quality in certain lighting. Hair described as blonde, platinum blonde, silver white, or occasionally described as so light it appears white even on what appear to be young adults. Eyes described most commonly as blue, but a blue of unusual depth or intensity, sometimes described as violet, sometimes described as capable of luminescence. Facial features described consistently as refined and symmetrical, without the asymmetry that characterizes most human faces. Muscle tone described as lean but notably strong. Movement described as fluid, deliberate, and somehow slightly too smooth to be entirely natural. The clothing descriptions vary more than the physical descriptions. In the 1950s encounters, the beings were frequently described in one-piece jumpsuits of metallic or iridescent fabric. In later decades, the clothing becomes more varied. Sometimes they appear in clothing indistinguishable from contemporary human dress, which forms the basis of the infiltration hypothesis we will examine in Part 11. In some accounts, they wear no distinctive clothing at all, which some researchers interpret as evidence of holographic projection or perceptual manipulation, that the witness is seeing what the being wishes them to see. The communication methods are another area of striking consistency. Most witnesses report that the Nordics communicate in perfect, unaccented versions of whatever language the witness speaks: English, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, German, Japanese. This is immediately suspicious to a skeptic, and reasonably so. But the alternative explanation, that these beings have achieved sufficient mastery of human languages and their acoustic peculiarities to pass as native speakers, is, if anything, more unsettling than a supernatural interpretation. Some witnesses report communication that appears partially or entirely telepathic, words that are heard not with the ears, but as thoughts that seem to arrive fully formed in the mind, carrying information too dense and too fast to have been conveyed by spoken language. Several witnesses report a kind of data download experience in which vast amounts of information seem to be communicated in a fraction of a second, though the witness may spend years unpacking what was transmitted. The message content across hundreds of documented encounters is similarly consistent. There are recurring themes that appear in contacts from Brazil in 1957, from Switzerland in 1975, from Russia in 1989, from England in 1997, and from the United States in 2014. The themes are these: humanity is at a critical juncture in its development. The nuclear weapons programs of the major powers pose an existential threat not only to humanity but to something larger, to a structure or order of things that extends beyond Earth. Humanity is being monitored and in certain cases guided, but the Nordics do not intervene directly in human affairs by choice or by constraint. The accounts differ on which it is. Something is coming, a period of transformation, crisis, or change that the Nordics seem to regard as both dangerous and necessary. And humanity is not alone in its solar system, in its galaxy, or in the broader community of conscious beings in the universe. A community the Nordics appear to be part of, and to which they are suggesting humanity may eventually belong, if it survives what is coming. These are not the messages of a confused civilian inventing a contact story. They are coherent, consistent across cultures, and in several cases have been accompanied by technical information that witnesses had no prior knowledge of, and that has subsequently been verified or is consistent with physics at the frontier of current understanding. We will examine specific cases of technical information transfer in parts 4 and 8. Now let us establish the scale of what we are dealing with. A 2019 Gallup poll found that 33% of Americans, roughly 1 in 3, believe that some UFOs are alien spacecraft. A 2021 survey across 12 European nations found similar numbers. These are not fringe beliefs. They represent the quiet majority of human beings who look at the accumulating evidence and conclude that the official narrative that Earth is the only inhabited planet in a universe of 2 trillion galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, is not credible. And increasingly, that quiet majority has institutional support. In 2021, the United States government, through the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, officially acknowledged the existence of unexplained aerial phenomena that its own intelligence apparatus cannot explain. In 2023, a decorated military intelligence officer named David Grush testified under oath before the United States Congress that the government has recovered non-human craft and non-human biological material. In 2024, multiple additional witnesses with classified clearances came forward to corroborate Grush's testimony. The conversation has shifted. The question is no longer whether something real is happening. The question is what it is. And so we begin. 10 proofs, each one meticulously documented, each one pointing in the same direction. The beings described across centuries and continents as tall, fair, and possessed of capabilities beyond human technology are not myth. They are not mass hallucination. They are not the invention of a handful of attention-seeking fraudsters. They are, by the weight of the evidence we are about to present, real. And if they are real, then the implications for every assumption humanity holds about its own history, its own origins, and its own place in the cosmos are so vast that most human minds instinctively recoil from the conclusion, which may, in fact, be precisely why the knowledge has been kept from us for so long. Let us begin with the beginning. Let us go back to the moment when the modern Nordic encounter phenomenon burst into public consciousness and trace it forward from there. Because the first proof is not a government document or a piece of physical evidence. It is the accumulated weight of human testimony, testimony that no amount of ridicule, debunking, or institutional dismissal has ever been able to make go away. Proof 1. The contact wave. The Adamski cases, the contactees, and the testimony that started everything. On the afternoon of November 20th, 1952, a group of 7 people drove into the California desert near Desert Center, a small settlement in Riverside County. The group included George Adamski, a Polish-born American author and amateur astronomer who operated a small cafe and telescope near Palomar Mountain. Also present were Dr. George Hunt Williamson, a researcher, Alice K. Wells, the owner of the property where Adamski operated his cafe, Betty Bailey, Lucy McGinnis, and 2 others. What occurred in the desert that afternoon became one of the most consequential events in the history of the UFO phenomenon. Not because it was the most dramatic, not because it produced the most physical evidence, but because it was the first thoroughly documented, multiply-witnessed account of a direct face-to-face encounter with a human-appearing being from another world. Adamski had been observing the skies for months, convinced that he had photographed craft of non-terrestrial origin through his telescope. On that November afternoon, the group drove out into the desert after Adamski reported a strong intuition, or, he later claimed, a direct mental impression, that a meeting was imminent. Some distance from the group, Adamski walked alone into the desert. And then, according to his subsequent sworn account and the sworn affidavits of the other 6 witnesses, a small craft descended and a figure emerged. The figure was male in appearance, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, which is shorter than the average Nordic description but within the range. The hair was long, reaching to the shoulders, and appeared golden brown in the desert light. The skin was fair and smooth. The eyes were described as brown, which departs from the typical blue in Nordic accounts and has led some researchers to classify the Venusian, as Adamski called him, as a separate subtype. The being wore a reddish-brown, seamless garment that appeared to be a single piece covering the body from neck to feet. The face was described as the face of a man in his late 20s, with features that Adamski later described as too perfect, too symmetrical, too unblemished, to be easily categorized as belonging to any particular human ethnicity. Communication was conducted through a combination of gesture, mental impression, and what Adamski described as a remarkable capacity for the being to pick up Adamski's own thoughts and respond to them without waiting for spoken words. The being communicated a concern about nuclear testing, about the dangerous vibrations that atomic detonations sent through the fabric of space in ways that affected not only Earth but surrounding regions of the solar system. He indicated that he was from Venus, though later researchers, including some of Adamski's earliest defenders, have suggested that the planetary reference was either metaphorical, mistranslated through the gestural communication, or that Venus was used as a reference to a dimensional or frequency state rather than the physical planet. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour. The being returned to his craft. The craft departed. The 6 witnesses who had watched from a distance signed sworn affidavits describing what they had observed: the small craft, the figure that emerged, the conversation conducted between Adamski and the figure, and the departure. These affidavits were witnessed by a notary public. They are real legal documents, filed and preserved. Not one of the 6 witnesses ever retracted their testimony. Not one of them profited substantially from their association with the event. Several of them, in fact, spent the rest of their lives dealing with professional and social ridicule as a result of being connected to it. Their collective testimony, under the standards applied to any other category of human testimony in a court of law or an academic study, would constitute significant evidence that something real occurred in the California desert on November 20th, 1952. But Adamski was only the first, and in some ways, he is not even the most credible of the early contactees, because within the following 5 years, at least 8 other individuals in at least 5 different countries independently reported experiences that paralleled Adamski's in ways that should have been impossible if all of them were independently fabricating. Truman Bethurem was a mechanic from Nevada. He was not an author, he was not a researcher, he was a working-class tradesman who, by his account, had no prior interest in flying saucers or extraterrestrial life when he first encountered what he described as a small disk hovering above the ground near Mormon Mesa, Nevada, in late 1952. The beings aboard the disk were described as olive-skinned and dark-haired rather than blonde, which has led some researchers to distinguish them from the Nordic category. But their commander, a woman he called Aura Rains, is described in terms that echo almost exactly the physical perfection noted in Nordic accounts, unusually symmetrical, possessing a quality of physical beauty that seemed to go beyond normal human variation, moving with a fluid grace that was slightly unnatural. More important than the physical description is the message content. Bethurem's accounts of his conversations with Aura Rains center on the same themes that appear throughout the Nordic encounter literature: the fragility of humanity's current trajectory, the importance of spiritual development, the existence of a community of civilizations that watches Earth with a mixture of concern and hope. Daniel Fry was a technical employee at the White Sands Proving Ground, the New Mexico facility where the United States conducted rocket tests and where, in 1947, something had crashed in the desert near Roswell. Fry was not a fringe figure. He held a legitimate position at a legitimate defense installation, which is precisely why his account is so difficult to dismiss. In July 1950, Fry claims to have observed a disc-shaped craft land near the base and to have been addressed by a being who spoke to him through what he initially believed was a radio or speaker system, but later concluded was a form of projected telepathy. The being identified himself as Alan and described an origin that he associated with a human-like civilization that had achieved space travel thousands of years earlier. Alan's physical description, as given by Fry, matches the Nordic template closely: tall, fair, blonde, possessed of remarkable physical perfection. The messages delivered through their subsequent conversations focused on the necessity of humanity developing a sufficient level of consciousness to match its developing technology. A theme that appears in Nordic encounter accounts with a regularity that suggests either a coordinated message or the same recurring preoccupation of a single external intelligence. Howard Menger was a sign painter and Army veteran from New Jersey who, by his account, had been in contact with Nordic-type beings since childhood. His adult contact experiences, which began in the late 1940s and continued through the 1950s, are remarkable for their physical detail and their consistency with the broader Nordic encounter literature. Menger described beings of extraordinary physical beauty, tall, blonde, radiantly healthy, who arrived in craft that made no sound and left no ground disturbance. He described being shown interiors of these craft. He described being taken on trips that he believed were to the moon and other locations. He described receiving objects: a potato-like vegetable he claimed was from Mars, mechanical components he claimed were from extraterrestrial technology, some of which were subsequently examined by researchers. And he described, with particular emphasis, the emotional and psychological effect of being in the presence of these beings. A profound sense of peace, of love, of being in the presence of something far older and wiser than anything human, that consistently overwhelmed whatever analytical faculties the witness was trying to employ. This emotional response, this wave of benevolence and calm that witnesses describe as radiating from Nordic beings, is one of the most consistent and most inexplicable elements of the encounter literature. Orfeo Angelucci was a factory worker in California. He had been in poor health for years when, in May 1952, he encountered what he described as two glowing spheres while driving home from work. A voice from the spheres engaged him in a lengthy conversation about the nature of humanity, the reality of other civilizations, and the spiritual evolution that humanity was being called to undertake. Angelucci was subsequently shown a vision of two beings, a man and a woman, both tall, blonde, radiantly beautiful, whom he came to identify as representatives of a civilization that had once visited Earth in antiquity. His subsequent accounts, recorded in his 1955 book, The Secret of the Saucers, contain the full Nordic package: the physical description, the message content, the emotional impact, and the ongoing contact experience that continued over a period of years. What is striking about these early contactees is not the strangeness of their accounts, it is the consistency. These were individuals with no professional connection to each other, living in different states, with different educational backgrounds, different economic circumstances, and different prior beliefs about the nature of reality. They did not know each other when their experiences began. Some of them met later, at the UFO conferences that began to be organized in the mid-1950s, and some of them were clearly influenced by each other's published accounts. But the core of each account, the physical description of the beings, the communication style, the message content, the emotional impact, precedes any cross-contamination. It is there in the earliest reports, before any of these men had published a word or attended a conference or heard anyone else's story. In South America, the contactee wave produced figures even more credible in some respects, because they were operating entirely outside the American cultural context, where the gray alien narrative was already beginning to take shape. In 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Vilas Boas reported an encounter that is among the most physically detailed and physically verifiable in the literature. Vilas Boas was plowing his fields at night, a common practice in rural Brazil during hot summers, when a craft landed in his field, and he was taken aboard by beings he described as approximately 5 feet 4 to 5 feet 7 in height, with fair skin, light eyes, and blonde hair visible beneath what appeared to be helmets. The beings subjected him to a medical examination and then introduced a female being who was strikingly different from the others, described in terms of extreme physical attractiveness, with large blue eyes, a very fair complexion, high cheekbones, and red pubic and underarm hair. The sexual encounter that followed is the most controversial element of the Vilas Boas case, and has led to its being treated either as a landmark in the contact literature or as an obvious confabulation, depending on the researcher's priors. What is less controversial and less widely known is that Vilas Boas subsequently experienced physical symptoms that were independently documented by a physician named Olavo Fontes, who examined him months after the encounter. Fontes documented scarring, lesions, and a constellation of symptoms consistent with radiation exposure, symptoms that Vilas Boas would have had no means of self-inflicting and no reason to fake. The medical documentation exists. It has been examined by independent researchers. It is real, and it constitutes physical evidence that something happened to Antonio Vilas Boas in that field in October 1957, something that involved exposure to a source of radiation he had no access to through any conventional means. The European wing of the early contactee wave is perhaps the most intriguing precisely because it developed in parallel with the American cases without any significant cultural exchange. In England, in France, in Germany, in Italy, individuals were reporting encounters with tall, fair, human-appearing beings throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Italian case files of Centro Ufologico Nazionale, one of the oldest and most meticulous UFO research organizations in the world, contain dozens of independently filed reports from the early 1950s, describing beings who match the Nordic template precisely. These witnesses, Italian farmers, factory workers, truck drivers, professionals, had no access to the American contactee literature. They were not reading George Adamski's books. They were not attending UFO conferences. They were reporting what they experienced, and what they reported was the same thing their American, Brazilian, and Northern European counterparts were reporting. The most remarkable of the early European contacts is the case of Eugenio Siragusa, a Sicilian postal worker who reported his first encounter with Nordic beings in 1952 and continued reporting ongoing contact for the following 5 decades. Siragusa's accounts are distinguished by their specificity, their internal consistency over 50 years of continued contact, and the fact that multiple independent witnesses corroborated elements of his experiences at various points. He described beings indistinguishable from Northern European humans in physical appearance, who communicated messages about nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and humanity's need to develop spiritual consciousness before it destroyed itself. In the 1970s, he established a community of followers in Sicily, a decision that has led mainstream UFO researchers to treat him with suspicion, since the line between contactee and cult leader is one that the encounter literature has crossed before. But the foundational accounts from 1952 and the early 1950s were filed before any community was established, before any followers were gathered, and before Siragusa had any conceivable personal incentive for fabrication. There are, of course, frauds in the contactee literature. There have always been frauds. The 1950s were a period of genuine social turbulence, the Cold War, the nuclear threat, the collapse of the certainties of the pre-war world, and the UFO phenomenon offered both genuine mystery and genuine opportunity for exploitation by individuals willing to take advantage of the public's hunger for meaning and reassurance. Some of the contactee figures of the 1950s were almost certainly charlatans. Some were probably sincere but deluded. Some were sincere, psychologically stable, and almost certainly reporting real experiences that they lacked the conceptual framework to accurately interpret. The question for the serious researcher is not whether every contactee account is genuine. Clearly, they are not all genuine. The question is whether, when you strip away the frauds and the delusions and the genuine mistakes, there remains a residue of accounts that cannot be explained away, accounts that meet the criteria for credibility that we apply to testimony in every other domain of human investigation. And the answer is yes, there is such a residue. It runs from Adamski's multiply-witnessed 1952 desert encounter through Villas Boas's medically documented 1957 experience, through the dozens of European cases filed with meticulous UFO research organizations throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It is a residue that points consistently at the same phenomenon: contact with human-appearing beings of apparently extraterrestrial origin, delivering messages of universal and urgent concern, and leaving behind physical and medical evidence that cannot be explained by conventional means. This is the first proof, not the most dramatic, not the most scientifically rigorous, but in some ways the most fundamental, because it establishes that the Nordic encounter phenomenon is not a modern invention, not a cultural artifact of the UFO entertainment industry, not something that can be traced to a single origin story or a single influential fraud. It is old, it is widespread, it is consistent, and it has been documented from the very beginning of the era in which human beings began to observe the sky with the seriousness and the instruments that genuine observation requires. The contactee wave of the 1950s and 1960s did not end. It transformed. The reports became less public. The cultural ridicule of the 1960s and 1970s drove most witnesses into silence. The research became more systematic. Organizations like the Mutual UFO Network in the United States, Bufora in Great Britain, and GIPAN in France began applying rigorous investigative methodologies to encounter reports. The physical evidence became more carefully documented, and the phenomenon itself seems to have evolved or to have changed its approach in ways that we will trace through the subsequent parts of this investigation. But it began here, with 7 sworn affidavits in the California desert, with a mechanic in Nevada, a factory worker in New Jersey, a sign painter in the army, a farmer in Brazil, a postal worker in Sicily, with ordinary people whose extraordinary accounts taken together constitute the foundation of one of the most significant and most thoroughly suppressed bodies of evidence in human history. The word ancient is doing a great deal of work in the discourse around ancient aliens, and it is important at the outset to specify what counts as meaningful evidence and what does not. A vague description of lights in the sky in an ancient text tells us very little. The natural phenomena available to ancient observers, meteors, comets, ball lightning, aurora borealis, atmospheric refraction, are more than sufficient to explain most historical accounts of lights or fire or strange apparitions in the heavens. What is not sufficient to explain is the specific, repeated, cross-cultural appearance of beings described in terms that match the Nordic encounter profile with a precision that defies coincidence. We will examine 6 specific bodies of ancient evidence: the Vedic texts of ancient India, the Norse mythological tradition, the Sumerian cuneiform records, the Egyptian religious literature, the medieval European accounts of supernatural beings, and the indigenous traditions of several North American cultures. Each of these bodies of evidence is vast. Each has been the subject of serious academic scholarship entirely independent of UFO research, and each contains within that scholarship anomalies that the academic framework cannot satisfactorily account for. We begin with the oldest of our sources, the Vedic texts of ancient India. The Vedas, the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharva Veda are among the oldest religious texts in human history, with oral traditions that scholars believe predate the written texts by at least a millennium, potentially placing their origins at or before 3000 BCE. The Vedas describe a cosmology that is, by any modern standard, astonishing in its scope. The universe is depicted as vast, ancient, and populated by an enormous variety of conscious beings across multiple planes of existence. But within this cosmology, there is a specific class of beings that demands attention, the Devas. The Devas are described in the Vedic literature as beings of extraordinary beauty and luminosity who descend from the sky in vehicles called vimanas. The vimana descriptions vary. Some are described as palaces, some as chariots, some as aerial vehicles that travel at the speed of thought. But the consistent element is that they are craft of extraordinary sophistication that move through the sky and sometimes through space. The beings who inhabit these craft, the Devas, are described as tall, radiant, and golden in their physical appearance. The Sanskrit word used most frequently to describe them is divya, meaning luminous or divine, but in context, clearly referring to a physical quality rather than a purely metaphysical one. The Devas are depicted as interacting directly with humans, engaging in relationships with human beings, teaching technology and knowledge, participating in what the texts describe as wars that occurred partly in the sky and partly on the ground. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, epics that draw heavily on Vedic tradition, contain extraordinarily detailed accounts of aerial warfare conducted with weapons that some scholars have interpreted as descriptions of energy weapons and explosive devices far beyond the technology of their era. The Devas are consistently described as benevolent toward certain humans and hostile toward others. They have preferences, allegiances, and in some cases what appear to be strategic interests in human affairs. They interbreed with humans, producing offspring of unusual ability and physical perfection, and they are explicitly described as not being gods in the sense of supernatural or metaphysical entities. The Vedic texts are remarkably clear that the Devas are physical beings who exist in physical space and who are distinguished from humans primarily by their technological capabilities, their longevity, and their spiritual or evolutionary advancement, not by any fundamental ontological difference. This is precisely the relationship described in modern Nordic encounter accounts, not divine intervention from a metaphysical realm. Physical beings in physical craft with physical interests and physical limitations interacting with human beings across a vast span of time. The Vedic texts are not describing God. They are describing something far stranger and far more specific, an advanced civilization that visited Earth, interacted with its inhabitants, and was remembered in the subsequent religious literature of one of humanity's oldest surviving cultures. Moving west and north, we arrive at the Norse mythological tradition. Norse mythology has been subjected to so much popular adaptation in films, in comic books, in video games, that it requires some effort to look past the entertainment layer and engage with the original material. The original material, preserved in the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda compiled in Iceland in the 13th century, but drawing on oral traditions that reach back to at least the Viking Age and probably much further, is a remarkably coherent cosmological system describing the structure of existence, the nature of consciousness, and the beings who inhabit the upper levels of that structure. The Aesir, the primary pantheon of Norse mythology, are described with a specificity of physical detail that is striking in comparison to the vague supernaturalism of many other religious traditions. Odin is described as tall, with a long beard and one eye, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long cloak. Thor is described as enormous, red-haired, with superhuman physical strength. Freya is described as a being of extraordinary beauty, associated with gold and with the practice of satyr, a form of magic or altered state perception that some researchers have connected to the telepathic communication reported in Nordic encounter accounts. But it is the Vanir, the older gods who precede the Aesir in the Norse cosmological timeline, who most closely match the Nordic encounter description. The Vanir are associated with fertility, peace, wisdom, and a deep knowledge of nature and natural processes. They are described as physically golden, luminous, and of a beauty that exceeds human norms. Their home, Vanaheim, is described as a realm beyond the sky, reachable by the craft of the gods. Most significant for our purposes is the Norse concept of the Alfar, the elves. The word elf in modern usage has been so thoroughly colonized by fantasy literature as to be almost useless for serious analysis. But the original Alfar of Norse mythology are beings of extraordinary significance and extraordinary physical description. The Ljósalfar, the light elves, are described as beautiful beyond human description, luminous, dwelling in a realm called Alfheimr, that is situated in the heavens. The Old Norse adjective used for them is fegri, fairer or more beautiful than the sun. They interact with humans, sometimes benevolently, sometimes by their own rules and interests. They possess knowledge that exceeds human capacity, and they are described not as supernatural in the sense of being immaterial or metaphysical, but as physical beings from another realm of physical existence, who move between their world and ours through means the texts describe in terms of travel rather than miraculous apparition. The connection between the Ljósalfar of Norse mythology and the Nordic alien description is not merely a physical resemblance, striking as that is. It is in the character of the interaction, the nature of the relationship, and the consistent emphasis on a benevolence that is real but conditional. These beings help humanity, but on their own terms, according to their own agenda, and without necessarily explaining themselves. This is precisely the character of the Nordic encounter, as reported across thousands of modern accounts. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian cuneiform texts, the oldest written records yet discovered, dating to approximately 3400 BCE, describe a class of beings called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki have been the subject of significant popular misinterpretation, largely through the work of Zecharia Sitchin, whose translations of the Sumerian texts are considered by most academic scholars to be inaccurate. But the Anunnaki themselves, setting aside Sitchin's interpretive framework, are real figures in the cuneiform record, and their description is revealing. They are described as beings of great height and luminosity who descend from the sky. They are described as having a hand in the creation or modification of human beings, a theme that connects directly to the genetic evidence we will examine in Part 8. They are described as establishing the first human civilizations, teaching the arts of agriculture, writing, mathematics, and governance. And they are described as physically beautiful, tall, golden-skinned, or radiant in ways that match the Nordic profile. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the most thoroughly studied texts in the world, contains descriptions of the hero Enkidu that researchers have noted are remarkably similar to the Nordic encounter description. Enkidu is described as having been shaped by the goddess Aruru to be godlike in appearance, with the body of the sky god and the power of the storm god. He is described as covered in hair, an element that clearly distinguishes him from the smooth-skinned Nordic description, but the underlying quality of being godlike in physical form, existing at the boundary between human and divine, interacting with human beings as something other than human, while still being physically present and physically real, is precisely the quality that characterizes Nordic encounter accounts. The Egyptian religious tradition offers perhaps the most archaeologically documented version of the tall, luminous, non-human but human-appearing visitor. The Netjeru, the Egyptian gods, are depicted in the religious art and funerary literature with a range of physical forms. But the most senior of the Netjeru, those associated with the first time and with the creation of civilization, are depicted as physically human in form and of unusual beauty. The pharaoh's divine nature was described in terms that placed him at the intersection of the human and the divine, and the physical characteristics of the divine were tall stature, luminous skin, large, wide-set eyes, and a quality of physical perfection. The Djed pillar, the Ankh symbol, and numerous other elements of Egyptian religious iconography have been interpreted by alternative researchers as representing technology, power sources, communication devices, medical equipment. Whether or not these interpretations are correct, the consistent depiction of the divine as physically present, physically tall, and physically luminous is striking. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious corpus in Egypt, carved on the walls of the burial chambers of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, describe the afterlife journey of the pharaoh in terms of an actual journey through physical space to a realm described in ways that match a description of space travel. Crossing the Duat, navigating between the stars, arriving at a specific location in the sky identified with Orion's belt and the Pleiades. The Orion-Pleiades connection in Egyptian religious geography connects to the Pleiadian hypothesis for Nordic origin that we will explore in Part 4, and it connects to a pattern of astronomical sophistication in the ancient record that far exceeds what the conventional academic timeline of human development can account for. The medieval European accounts of supernatural beings constitute a body of evidence that is simultaneously more recent than the ancient texts and in some ways more precise in its descriptive detail. The fairy tradition of medieval Europe, documented in thousands of accounts collected by ethnographers, clergy, and local authorities from the 9th through the 17th centuries, describes beings of extraordinary physical beauty who inhabit a realm just beyond human perception, travel in groups often associated with lights in the sky, abduct humans for purposes that are never entirely clear, and return them after periods of time that may have been experienced differently by the abductees than by the surrounding human community. The fairy of medieval European tradition is not the decorative, diminutive creature of Victorian fantasy. In the original accounts, the Seedi of Irish tradition, the Tuatha De Danann, the Tylwyth Teg of Wales, and equivalent beings in the traditions of Scotland, England, France, and Germany are described as tall, fair, beautiful, and uncanny in their near-human quality. They are described as existing just beyond normal human sensory range, visible at certain times and in certain states of consciousness, capable of moving between their world and the human world through means that the accounts describe in terms of doorways, thresholds, and transition points. They are described as abducting humans, particularly women of childbearing age and children, for purposes that the folklore associates with genetic exchange, with a need for human vitality or genetic material that their own population apparently lacks, and they are described as returning abductees who are forever changed by the experience, who possess knowledge or abilities they did not have before, and who often find themselves unable to integrate back into ordinary human society. The parallel with modern abduction accounts is so precise that the researcher Jacques Vallée, one of the most rigorous and academically credible figures in the history of UFO research, devoted an entire book, Passport to Magonia, to documenting it. Vallée does not argue that the medieval fairy is literally the same phenomenon as the modern UFO abduction. He argues that both are manifestations of the same underlying reality, which human cultures have interpreted through the framework of whatever mythology and conceptual apparatus was available to them at the time. The fairy is not a UFO alien, but the fairy and the UFO alien may be two cultural expressions of the same physical phenomenon, and the physical description of the finest grade fairy account and the Nordic alien account are close enough to suggest a common referent. In the indigenous traditions of North America, similar beings appear with striking regularity. The Hopi tradition describes the Kachinas, beings who descend from the sky, live in certain mountains, and intervene in human affairs at critical moments. The star ancestor traditions of the Lakota, the Navajo, the Cherokee, and many other nations describe beings who came from specific star systems, often Pleiades, often Sirius, often Orion, and who interacted with humanity at the dawn of civilization. The Zuni tradition describes the Koyemsi, clown-like mediating beings who cross between worlds, but their tradition also contains accounts of tall, fair, luminous beings associated with specific stars who taught the first agriculture and the first astronomy. The Cherokee have a tradition of beings they call the Nunnehi, a word often translated as people who live anywhere or the immortals, who are described as human in appearance, possessed of extraordinary beauty, and inhabiting a world that exists in parallel to the human world. The Nunnehi are described as occasionally appearing to humans in times of crisis, offering assistance and guidance, and then returning to their hidden world. The physical description, tall, fair, beautiful, possessed of a quality of physical perfection that marks them as other than ordinary humans, matches the Nordic encounter profile. What we are looking at across these 6 bodies of ancient evidence is not a collection of related myths that all spring from the same cultural source. The Vedic tradition and the Norse tradition share no common root. The Sumerian tradition and the Cherokee tradition share no common root. The Egyptian tradition and the medieval Irish tradition share no common root, and yet they all describe, in remarkably consistent terms, the same type of being: physical, humanoid, tall, fair, or luminous, technologically or supernaturally capable, interested in human affairs, intermittently communicative, occasionally beneficial, and ultimately from somewhere that is not Earth. The probability that this consistency is accidental is vanishingly small. The probability that each of these traditions independently invented the same type of being from whole cloth is effectively zero. The more parsimonious explanation, the one that accounts for the evidence with the fewest additional assumptions, is that the ancient record reflects genuine historical interactions between human beings and beings of non-human origin, whose physical description matches what modern witnesses report. The ancient record is not proof in the scientific sense, but it is evidence, powerful, cross-cultural, remarkably consistent evidence that the Nordic encounter phenomenon is not new. It is as old as humanity's capacity to record what it has seen. In a small farming community in the canton of Zurich, Switzerland, a one-armed man began photographing spacecraft in 1975. His name was Edward Albert Meyer, known to his followers and to the UFO research community as Billy Meyer. Over the course of the next several decades, he would produce the most extensive body of alleged extraterrestrial contact evidence ever assembled by a single individual. Hundreds of photographs, hours of filmed footage, metal samples, plant samples, audio recordings, and a multi-volume written record of conversations conducted with beings he called the Plejaren, who he stated came from a star cluster he identified as the Pleiades, in a region of space approximately 500 light-years from Earth. The Meyer case is simultaneously the most documented and the most controversial case in the history of UFO contact research. It has been championed by credible investigators, including the former U.S. Army colonel and aerospace engineer Wendell Stevens, who spent years examining Meyer's physical evidence, and viciously attacked by skeptics who have presented alleged debunking evidence of their own. The debate around the Meyer case is ongoing, bitter, and in some respects unresolvable because key pieces of original evidence are no longer available for examination. But within the controversy, there are elements of the Meyer case that have withstood scrutiny in ways that demand serious engagement. Billy Meyer lost his arm in a bus accident in Turkey in 1965. He lived with his wife and children on a small farm in Hinterschmidrudi in the canton of Zurich. He had no particular technological sophistication and no financial resources that would have enabled an elaborate hoax. He was not well connected in the UFO research community when his contact claims began. He was a rural farmer with a prosthetic arm, limited formal education, and a lifestyle that offered no particular incentive for elaborate deception. These biographical facts do not prove his accounts are genuine, but they are part of the context in which the evidence has to be evaluated. The being with whom Meyer claimed primary contact was a woman he called Semjase. By his account, Semjase was approximately 400 years old by the reckoning of her people, which had a longer lifespan than humanity. She appeared to be in her mid-20s by human standards. She was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall. Her skin was fair, her eyes were blue, and her hair was light blonde, worn in a style that Meyer described as above shoulder length. Her face was described as extraordinarily beautiful in the symmetrical, almost impossibly perfect way that characterizes nearly every high-grade Nordic encounter account. She wore a silver-gray one-piece garment. She communicated in German, Meyer's native language, with an accent he found difficult to place. And she began, in January 1975, a series of meetings with Meyer that continued across a period of years and resulted in the documentation of hundreds of contacts thousands of pages of written transmission, and the physical evidence that became the most analyzed collection of alleged extraterrestrial material ever assembled. What survived the analysis, more than the skeptics would prefer to acknowledge? The photographs Meyer took of the craft, using a standard camera with no digital manipulation capability since the contacts predate digital photography, were subjected to analysis by experts in photography, optics, and image enhancement. The most thorough independent analysis was conducted by a team that included analysts from Ground Saucer Watch, an organization known for its aggressive application of photo enhancement techniques to alleged UFO images, an organization that had previously exposed numerous hoax photographs. The Ground Saucer Watch analysis of 7 of Meyer's key photographs concluded that the images showed real, three-dimensional objects of considerable size, not models suspended on strings or pasted onto photographic backgrounds. The analysis found no evidence of double exposure, no evidence of string or wire suspension, and structural detail consistent with genuine, large, three-dimensional craft. The metal samples, pieces of material that Meyer claimed were given to him by the Plejaren, were subjected to analysis by multiple independent laboratories. Marcel Vogel, a research chemist at IBM who held more than 30 patents for his work in liquid crystal technology and who had no prior involvement in UFO research, analyzed a metal sample from Meyer in 1979 and found it to be unlike any alloy in the available scientific reference literature. Vogel's analysis indicated a material composed of multiple elements in configurations that suggested fabrication techniques beyond the current capability of human metallurgy. He described the sample in a recorded statement as a demonstration of a technological sophistication that could not be duplicated in any facility he was aware of. Vogel was not a credulous individual. He was a working scientist with an established career and a professional reputation to protect. His conclusions about the Meyer metal samples are not easily dismissed. The plant samples, specimens of a certain type of crystal that Meyer claimed were given to him and that exhibit properties not found in naturally occurring crystals of that type, were analyzed by the geologist and crystal specialist Marcel Vogel, a different Marcel Vogel than the IBM chemist, and found to have growth characteristics inconsistent with any natural formation process and with no known artificial crystal growing technique of the time. The crystal samples were subsequently lost, which is one of the frustrations of the Meyer case, a pattern of key physical evidence becoming unavailable for reanalysis as the decades pass. But the most compelling element of the Meyer case is not the physical evidence. It is the information content of the communications attributed to Semjase and her colleagues. Across thousands of pages of recorded conversations, Meyer's Plejaren contacts made a series of specific, factual claims about astronomy, physics, and the nature of the solar system that were subsequently confirmed by scientific discovery. In the mid-1970s, Meyer recorded communications from Semjase that described a planet beyond Pluto, a ninth body in the outer solar system significantly larger than Pluto. This claim, made years before the discovery of Pluto's moon Charon, which temporarily disrupted the planetary count, and decades before the serious scientific discussion of Planet 9 began in earnest, was at the time both unknown and, by the astronomical consensus of the era, considered unlikely. Current astronomical research, based on gravitational anomalies observed in the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects, has increasingly supported the hypothesis that a large planet mass body exists in the outer solar system beyond the orbit of Neptune. The prediction has not yet been confirmed, but its consonance with current scientific investigation is noteworthy. Semjase reportedly communicated information about Jupiter that described the planet's core as a kind of compressed gas that transitions through phases from gas to liquid to a state exhibiting properties of metallite. The concept of a metallic hydrogen core in Jupiter was a theoretical proposition in physics in the 1970s, but was by no means established or widely communicated outside specialist literature. It has since become accepted science, Jupiter's core is now understood to include a region of metallic hydrogen, a phase of hydrogen that behaves with properties resembling metal under the extreme pressures of the Jovian interior. How a one-armed Swiss farmer with limited formal education was recording these descriptions in the 1970s is not a question that the hoax hypothesis handles comfortably. The Pleiades themselves are central to the Nordic encounter hypothesis in ways that extend beyond the Meyer case. The Pleiades star cluster, visible to the naked eye in the constellation Taurus, consists of 7 primary stars that have been identified in the mythological traditions of cultures across the globe. The Pleiades appear in the mythological traditions of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the Vedic tradition of India, the Aboriginal Australians, the Maori of New Zealand, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin, the Lakota of North America, and dozens of other cultures with no historical connection to each other. In virtually every tradition, the Pleiades are associated with sky beings, with entities that descend from that part of the sky to interact with humanity. The 7 sisters of Aboriginal Australian tradition are sky women who taught humanity. The Greek Pleiades were daughters of the Titan Atlas, connected to navigation and agriculture. The Vedic Kritikas, the Indian name for the Pleiades, were associated with the god Agni and with fire that descended from the sky. In every case, the Pleiades are not merely stars, they are the home of beings who visit Earth. This convergence, the cross-cultural identification of the Pleiades as a point of origin for sky beings, is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of human mythology, or it is the memory of an actual historical reality preserved across thousands of years of cultural transmission. The Pleiades are approximately 444 light-years from Earth. By any conventional understanding of physics, this distance makes travel from the Pleiades to Earth impossible within a practical time frame. But Semjase, in her communications with Meyer, described a propulsion technology that circumvents the light speed barrier not by exceeding it, but by moving through a different relationship with space-time itself, essentially describing what modern physics would call a hyperspace drive or a warp field. The description predates serious mainstream physics discussion of such concepts by at least a decade. Whether or not Meyer's contacts were genuine, the information transmitted is remarkably consistent with the leading edge of physics research that followed. Beyond Meyer, the Pleiadian connection appears in dozens of other documented contact cases. Sixto Paz Wells, a Peruvian researcher who began his contact experiences in 1974, reported contact with beings identifying themselves as Plejaran, beings from the Pleiades, in terms almost identical to Meyer's, despite conducting his research entirely independently in South America and without access to Meyer's published materials. The Pleiadians communicated through Wells detailed cosmological and historical information that has been analyzed by independent researchers and found to contain elements that match Meyer's transmissions and that go significantly beyond what either Wells or Meyer could have independently constructed from available scientific literature. The channeled transmission literature, a category that mainstream UFO research approaches with considerable caution, contains a body of material attributed to Pleiadian sources that has been analyzed for internal consistency and for accuracy of technical claims. The raw material, channeled through Carla Ruckert beginning in 1981 and published as The Law of One, presents itself as a communication from a group of beings who describe themselves as having originated in the Pleiades and subsequently traveled through other systems, eventually adopting what they describe as a form that would appear to human observers as the Nordic type. The Law of One material contains cosmological, historical, and physical descriptions that are internally consistent across thousands of pages of channeled transmission conducted over a period of years, and that contain specific technical claims that have subsequently been corroborated by scientific discovery. The material was exhaustively analyzed by researcher Carla Ruckert and physicist Don Elkins, both of whom were trained in critical thinking, and both of whom, by the end of the process, concluded that the information being transmitted was not originating from Ruckert's own subconscious, but from an external source possessing knowledge beyond what was available to the human participants. The Pleiadian contact phenomenon, whether accessed through physical contact, channeled transmission, or the indirect evidence of ancient astronomical mythology, points consistently in the same direction. A civilization associated with the Pleiades has been in contact with Earth across an enormous span of time. The beings of this civilization match the Nordic physical description. Their messages are consistent with the message content of modern Nordic encounter accounts, and their communication with humanity has left traces in the mythological record of virtually every culture on Earth, a distribution of evidence so broad and so consistent that only a sustained, global, long-term presence can account for it. This is the third proof. Not merely that beings matching the Nordic description have visited Earth, but that they come from somewhere specific, a somewhere that has been identified consistently across cultures, across centuries, and across entirely independent lines of evidence. The Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, the star cluster that humanity has been looking at since before recorded history and calling, in its deepest mythological memory, home. Proof number 4. Government files and military encounters, declassified documents, official testimony, and the paper trail of contact. On June 24, 1947, a civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 shiny objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His description of their movement, which he likened to a saucer skipping across water, gave the UFO phenomenon its most enduring name. Even though Arnold's objects were not saucer-shaped, they were crescent-shaped and moved in a way he compared to a saucer being thrown. The saucer terminology stuck, and within days, the American public was consumed by a phenomenon that the military establishment was already treating with a level of concern that its subsequent public statements did not reflect. 3 weeks after Arnold's sighting, something crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. The Army Air Force initially announced the recovery of a flying disc. Then it walked that announcement back and announced it had been a weather balloon. The walkback was so implausible, the officials who delivered it so visibly uncomfortable with what they were saying, that it convinced a significant portion of the American public that the original announcement had been correct, and that whatever was being covered up was significant enough to warrant lying to the press and the American people. What followed Roswell was not silence. It was the beginning of a paper trail, a trail of documents, memoranda, internal communications, and witness testimonies that has been slowly, partially, grudgingly released over the following 7 decades, and that collectively constitutes one of the most compelling bodies of government evidence for the reality of non-human contact with Earth, and threading through this paper trail with a consistency that only emerges when you compare documents produced by agencies that were not sharing information with each other is the Nordic type. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's declassified UFO files, known collectively as the Vault, available on the FBI's public website, contain documents that have never been adequately explained or widely analyzed. Among these documents is a 1950 memorandum from the FBI's Guy Hotel, the special agent in charge of the Washington field office, to Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Hotel memo, as it is commonly known, reports information received by the FBI from a third party, an Air Force investigator, regarding the recovery of 3 flying saucers in New Mexico. The memo is real. It is dated March 22, 1950. It is available for public examination on the FBI's own website. The memo describes saucers approximately 50 feet in diameter, each one carrying the bodies of 3 occupants, approximately 3 feet in height, dressed in metallic cloth. The occupants in the Hotel memo do not match the Nordic description. They are small, which places them in the gray category rather than the Nordic. But the existence of this memo, an internal FBI communication describing the recovery of non-human biological material produced by an agency that was simultaneously publicly dismissing all UFO reports as misidentifications and hallucinations, establishes a fundamental point. The United States government was in possession of information about non-human contact that it was not sharing with the American public, and was treating that information as real enough to document in official communications. The Central Intelligence Agency's declassified files, now accessible through the CIA's FOIA reading room, contain hundreds of documents related to UFO phenomena, including internal memoranda from the 1950s expressing genuine concern about the national security implications of unidentified aerial phenomena. The Robertson Panel Report of 1953, a CIA-commissioned study of UFO reports that concluded, officially, that the phenomena posed no national security threat, contained classified appendices that were not released until the 1990s, and that reveal a very different internal conclusion. The classified sections of the Robertson Panel documentation discuss the phenomenon as real, as likely of non-terrestrial origin, and as a matter of ongoing concern to the intelligence community. The public recommendation for debunking and public education to reduce public interest in UFO reports, which influenced official policy for the following 2 decades, was designed not to arrive at truth, but to manage the public's relationship with a truth that the panel apparently believed the public was not prepared to handle. Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's official UFO investigation, which ran from 1952 to 1969, produced 12,618 case files in its 18 years of operation. Of these, 701 were officially classified as unknown, meaning that after rigorous investigation applying conventional explanatory frameworks, the Air Force's own investigators could find no conventional explanation. The Blue Book files have been partially declassified and are available in the National Archives. Within these files, there are multiple cases that include descriptions of human-appearing beings interacting with witnesses. These descriptions have been largely ignored in the mainstream analysis of the Blue Book files, which tends to focus on the craft descriptions rather than the occupant descriptions. But researchers who have gone through the occupant files carefully, notably the French researcher Fernand Lagarde and the American researcher Ted Blocher, have found dozens of cases in which the beings described match the Nordic profile. One such case, case number 7683 in the Blue Book files, involves a report from a military installation in which a guard describes encountering a tall, fair-haired individual in a seamless garment who appeared to have exited a craft observed on the ground nearby. The guard's description of the being's physical perfection, the symmetrical face, the unusual eye color, the quality of physical beauty that he struggled to describe but kept returning to, is textbook Nordic. The investigation notes in the file indicate that no conventional explanation was found, and that the witness was considered credible by the investigating officer. The case is classified as unknown. It sits in the National Archives, available for examination, essentially ignored by the mainstream discourse. Project Blue Book was officially terminated in 1969 with the publication of the Condon Report, a study commissioned by the Air Force and conducted by a team at the University of Colorado, led by physicist Edward Condon. The Condon Report concluded that UFO study was not yielding scientifically valuable results and recommended that Air Force involvement be discontinued. What the report did not disclose, and what was subsequently revealed through the work of researchers who analyzed its methodology, is that Condon entered the project with his conclusion already formed. In a private memo to a colleague in January 1967, before the investigation was even completed, Condon wrote that the study was one in which we have to convince the Air Force to get out of the UFO business, a statement that reveals the conclusion preceding the investigation rather than following from it. Robert Lowe, Condon's project coordinator, had written an internal memo in August 1966, before the project formally began, stating that the trick would be to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. This internal memo, known as the Lowe Memo, was discovered by 2 members of the Condon Committee and led to a crisis within the project. Condon dismissed the 2 scientists who found and publicized the memo, but the memo itself was real, and it fundamentally discredits the Condon Report as an objective scientific assessment. What replaced Blue Book after 1969? Officially, nothing. The Air Force publicly withdrew from UFO investigation. Unofficially, investigation continued, and the evidence for this comes not from conspiracy theory, but from declassified documents and the testimony of individuals with direct knowledge of the programs. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP is now officially acknowledged by the United States government. It ran from approximately 2007 to 2012, funded by a $22 million appropriation buried in the defense budget, and was managed out of the Pentagon by a career intelligence officer named Luis Elizondo. Elizondo resigned from the Pentagon in 2017 and subsequently became one of the most credible and most cautious public voices on the UAP phenomenon, consistently restricting his public statements to what he can directly attest to from his own experience. What Elizondo has attested to is significant, that during his tenure managing ATIP, he had access to material, including video footage, sensor data, and physical evidence, that convinced him and the analysts working with him that a genuine non-human phenomenon was occurring, that it involved craft capable of performance characteristics far beyond any known human technology, and that elements of the United States government with knowledge of this phenomenon were actively working to prevent its disclosure to the public or to elected officials. The three videos, designated FLIR 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, that were released to the public through the New York Times in December 2017 and subsequently officially confirmed as genuine by the Pentagon, represent the most significant official disclosure in the history of the UFO phenomenon. They show objects with no visible means of propulsion moving at speeds and making maneuvers that are physically impossible for any known human aircraft. They were captured by US Navy sensors during operational flights. They were authenticated by the military. They are real, and they are not explained. But the question of craft, while important, is not the focus of this proof. The focus of this proof is the Nordic type, the human-appearing being. And here, the most compelling testimony comes not from released documents, but from individuals with direct access to classified programs who have come forward with their accounts. Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project, a controversial but historically significant initiative that assembled testimony from over 400 military and intelligence witnesses, contains multiple accounts from credible individuals describing encounters with human-appearing beings in the context of classified programs. Among the most significant is the testimony of Sergeant Clifford Stone, a Vietnam veteran and Army specialist who was attached to what he describes as a secret UFO crash retrieval team. Stone's public testimony, delivered at the National Press Club in Washington in May 2001, describes his participation in the recovery of craft and occupants over a period of years. He describes occupants of multiple types, including beings that he describes as so similar in physical appearance to humans that they could walk among us undetected, who were treated by the programs he worked with as belonging to a category separate from the non-human types that required biological containment. The testimony of retired Air Force Captain Robert Salas is documented and corroborated. Salas was the duty officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana on March 16, 1967, when he received reports from security personnel of lights, unidentified flying objects, observed hovering over the base's nuclear missile silos. Within seconds of the first reports, 10 Minuteman war nuclear missiles in their silos went offline simultaneously in a fashion that the Air Force's own subsequent investigation could not explain through any known technical failure. The missiles did not experience a gradual failure. They shut down at essentially the same moment, as if a single external command had simultaneously deactivated them. Salas later discovered that the same thing had happened at a second Minuteman missile site at Malmstrom on the previous day. He has spent years attempting to bring this information to public attention and has testified before the Canadian Parliament, at the National Press Club, and in various other forums. His account has been corroborated by multiple other witnesses from the same incidents, and the implication is staggering. Whatever was hovering over those silos had the technical capability to simultaneously deactivate 10 armed nuclear missiles, a capability that no known nation possessed in 1967 and that would constitute a significant military asset even today. Salas's testimony doesn't identify the beings associated with the craft, but other witnesses from similar nuclear site encounters have described, in the context of subsequent security investigations, seeing human-appearing figures near the perimeter of the sites during these events. These accounts are deeply buried in classified investigation files that have been only partially released, but their existence has been confirmed by independent researchers who have obtained partial releases through the Freedom of Information Act. The most significant recent development in the government disclosure narrative is the congressional testimony of David Grush in July 2023. Grush, a decorated combat veteran who served as the representative of the National Reconnaissance Office to a UAP task force and as co-lead for UAP analysis at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee's National Security Subcommittee that the United States government, in conjunction with defense contractors, is in possession of non-human craft and non-human biological material recovered from crash sites. He stated that he has spoken with multiple individuals with direct first-hand knowledge of these programs, that these programs exist within a special access program structure that has been concealed from congressional oversight, and that individuals who have attempted to report this information through official channels have faced retaliation. Grush's testimony cannot be dismissed as the ravings of a marginal figure. He held a TS-SCI clearance, the highest tier of classified access. He was nominated for the Intelligence Community's Whistleblower of the Year award in 2022 before his public disclosures by his supervisors. His accounts have been corroborated by other individuals with classified clearances who have come forward through official whistleblower protection channels. The Inspector General of the Intelligence Community reviewed Grush's disclosures and found them to be credible and urgent, a legal determination with specific meaning, indicating that the Inspector General assessed the information as potentially accurate and potentially significant to the national security of the United States. A finding of credible and urgent from the Intelligence Community Inspector General is not a casual endorsement. It is a formal legal conclusion reached after investigation. What Grush has been careful not to state publicly, what he has told investigators he can describe only in classified settings, is the content of the biological material recovered. He has referenced, in carefully worded public statements, that the non-human biological material is consistent with the occupants of the recovered craft. He has described the general physical form of these occupants as distinct from the gray type that dominates popular imagination. He has used the phrase piloted craft in ways that imply beings capable of intentional navigation, and when pressed in private settings about the appearance of these beings, researchers who have spoken with him report that his descriptions are not of small, gray, insectoid entities, but of something more humanoid, something that, in the words of one researcher who spoke with Grush, was harder to describe precisely because it was harder to distinguish from human. The government paper trail is not a complete record. It is a partial, fragmentary, deliberately obscured record from which key documents have been removed, redacted, or destroyed. But what remains, the Hotel Memo, the Robertson Panel Appendices, the Blue Book Unknowns, the Condon Report Internal Communications, the AATIP videos, the Grush testimony, constitutes a pattern of official knowledge, official concealment, and gradual official acknowledgement that the phenomenon is real, that it involves non-human intelligence, and that elements of that non-human intelligence are physical, apparently biological, and, in at least some of the accounts that have leaked from the most deeply classified programs, disturbingly, uncomfortably, impossibly human in their appearance. Proof, Burger 5, physical evidence and biological effects. Ground traces, medical documentation, and the body of evidence. The most persistent criticism of the UFO encounter field is the absence of physical evidence. If extraterrestrial craft are landing on Earth with the frequency suggested by the encounter literature, why are there no fragments of alien metal, no ground disturbances that cannot be explained, no physiological evidence on witnesses that confirms their exposure to technology beyond human capability? This criticism would be compelling if it were accurate. It is not accurate. Physical evidence exists in abundance. It has been collected, documented, and analyzed by researchers ranging from independent investigators to university laboratories. The problem is not the evidence. The problem is the lack of institutional interest in engaging with it seriously, and in some cases, the active suppression of evidence by parties who prefer that it not be examined. We will examine 5 categories of physical evidence: landing trace evidence, photographic and sensor data, medical and physiological effects on witnesses, implant recovery and analysis, and material recovered from crash sites or contact locations. Landing trace evidence is the category with the longest and most thoroughly documented record. The most extensively studied case of landing traces is the Delphos ring, a case that occurred in November 1971 on a farm near Delphos, Kansas, and that produced physical evidence that has been examined by multiple independent laboratories over the following decades. 16-year-old Ronald Johnson and his dog were in the family's field in the early evening when Johnson observed a mushroom-shaped illuminated craft hovering approximately 2 feet above the ground, approximately 30 yards away. The craft was emitting a bright, multicolored light that Johnson reported hurt his eyes when he looked directly at it. After an unknown amount of time, Johnson's sense of time was disrupted, which is a consistent feature of Nordic and other UFO encounter accounts. The craft rose, emitting a bright light, and disappeared over the trees. Johnson ran inside to tell his parents. All three returned to the landing site immediately. What they found was a glowing ring in the soil, approximately 8 feet in diameter, where the craft had been hovering. The ring was glowing with a faint luminescence. When Mrs. Johnson touched the soil within the ring, her fingers went numb, an effect that persisted for the following 2 weeks, and that was documented by a physician who examined her. The soil within the ring was bone dry despite recent rainfall and had undergone a chemical change that made it hydrophobic, repellent to water, in a way that persisted for months. The ring itself was visible for years after the event, continuing to exhibit unusual soil characteristics. Investigators from the University of Kansas, from the Mutual UFO Network, from private research organizations, and subsequently from academic laboratories analyzed soil samples from the ring and found them to contain elevated concentrations of sodium, potassium, and a crystalline substance that had not been definitively identified but was present only within the ring and absent in the surrounding soil. The hydrophobic properties of the soil were found to be caused by a coating on individual soil particles of a substance that appears to be of biological origin, a calcium-magnesium compound whose mechanism of formation and distribution across the soil particles within the ring could not be explained by any conventional process. The Delphos ring case won the National Enquirer's UFO Award in 1972, which sounds dismissive until you realize that the award was judged by a panel of academics, including a nuclear physicist, an astronomer, and a psychologist, and was the most rigorously assessed physical evidence case of the year. The Trans-en-Provence case of January 1981 is perhaps the most scientifically rigorous of all landing trace cases, because it was investigated by GPAN, the French government's official UFO investigation agency, which was at the time the only such body in the world operating with full governmental support and academic resources. On January 8, 1981, a farmer named Renato Nicolai in Trans-en-Provence, France, observed a craft land in his terraced garden, remain on the ground briefly, and then depart. He found traces on the ground, a circular area of compressed soil, and what appeared to be scrape marks consistent with landing pads. GPAN was notified and dispatched investigators within days. They collected soil samples, plant samples from the immediate area, and comparative samples from surrounding areas. The investigation was conducted with laboratory rigors that would have been appropriate for any academic research project. The results were extraordinary. The soil within the landing area showed evidence of having been subjected to temperatures of between 300 and 600 degrees Celsius, temperatures that would be produced by a craft with a significant heat signature, but that would also be clearly visible to a human observer and to surrounding vegetation if they were produced by any conventional means, which they were not. The plants within the landing area, alfalfa plants, which grow in a regular, well-documented pattern, showed biochemical changes that the analyzing laboratory, the National Institute for Agronomy Research in France, could not explain by reference to any known natural process. The plant samples showed deterioration of chlorophyll and a change in the biochemical constitution of the leaves that was consistent with exposure to a powerful electromagnetic field and a strong heat source simultaneously. The plants were essentially cooked from the inside, without the charring that would characterize externally applied heat. The Gipan investigators, the most cautious and academically credible government investigators ever applied to this type of evidence, concluded that a physical phenomenon of genuinely unknown nature had occurred at the Trans-en-Provence site, and that the evidence was inconsistent with any conventional explanation they could generate. The medical documentation of physiological effects on witnesses who report close encounters with Nordic beings is an equally compelling body of evidence. We have already noted the case of Antonio Villas-Boas, whose physician documented symptoms consistent with radiation exposure following his 1957 encounter. This is not an isolated case. The literature on close encounter witnesses contains dozens of documented cases of physiological effects that are consistent with exposure to electromagnetic radiation at levels not encountered in ordinary human environments. The case of Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and Colby Landrum, a grandmother, her daughter, and her 7-year-old grandson, who encountered a large diamond-shaped craft emitting intense heat and light from the bottom on a road near Huffman, Texas, on December 29, 1980, is among the best medically documented encounter cases in the literature. All 3 witnesses subsequently developed symptoms consistent with radiation exposure: nausea, vomiting, hair loss, skin blistering, eye inflammation, and in Cash's case, a serious deterioration in overall health that she attributed to the encounter and that never fully resolved before her death in 1998. Multiple physicians who treated these patients documented their symptoms. Cash and Landrum filed suit against the United States government, alleging that the craft was a government experimental vehicle. The suit was eventually dismissed on technical grounds, not on the merits. But the medical documentation of their symptoms is real, is preserved, and is consistent with the kind of radiation exposure that a craft operating with a nuclear or nuclear-adjacent power source would produce. In the Nordic encounter context specifically, the medical documentation tends to be somewhat different from the radiation burns of the Cash-Landrum type. Nordic contacts are more frequently associated with beneficent physiological effects: spontaneous healing of pre-existing conditions, improved eyesight, enhanced cognitive function, alongside the disorientation, time loss, and disassociated memories that characterize many close encounters, regardless of the type of being involved. But there are also documented cases of negative physiological effects following Nordic encounters, particularly when the contact involved resistance or involuntary elements. Researchers have documented cases in which witnesses who resisted Nordic contact physically experienced symptoms including muscle weakness, nausea, and a kind of neurological shock that took days to resolve. The mechanism proposed by researchers studying these effects is that the Nordics employ some form of directed energy field for communication, transportation, and in some cases, protection. And that close proximity to this field can have physiological effects depending on the power level and the individual's biological sensitivity. The implant phenomenon is one of the most controversial and potentially most physically significant areas of close encounter research. Since the 1980s, researchers and physicians have been aware of cases in which close encounter witnesses report discovering small objects in their bodies, typically in locations accessible to a superficial injection or implantation, such as the nasal cavity, the ear canal, the back of the hand, or behind the ear. In a significant number of cases, these objects have been surgically removed by physicians and subjected to laboratory analysis. The most systematic program of implant analysis has been conducted by Dr. Roger Lair, a California podiatric surgeon who performed surgical removal of alleged implants from multiple patients between 1995 and his death in 2014. Lair documented 14 surgical removals and subjected the resulting objects to analysis by a range of independent laboratories, including labs at the University of New Mexico and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The results of these analyses are not what a conventional debunking framework would predict. The objects analyzed are not shards of metal from prior injuries. They are not conventional medical implants. Several of the objects showed a coating of biological tissue, including nerve cells, that had grown around the object in a manner suggesting the body had integrated rather than rejected it, which is the opposite of what the human immune system typically does with foreign objects. The metal composition of several of the objects showed unusual elemental ratios. Several objects contained isotopic ratios, the ratio of different isotopes of the same element, that are measurably different from the ratios found in naturally occurring terrestrial materials, suggesting that the metals were processed or formed in a location where the relative abundance of isotopes differs from Earth's. This is the kind of evidence that should produce sustained scientific interest and rigorous follow-up investigation. Instead, it has been largely ignored by mainstream institutions. The specific connection to Nordic encounters in the implant literature is significant. The beings most commonly associated with implantation in the encounter literature are the gray type, the small, large-headed beings associated with medical examinations. Nordic encounters are less frequently associated with implantation, but not never. In a subset of Nordic encounter accounts, particularly those involving ongoing contact rather than a single event, witnesses report discovering implants that they subsequently attribute to their Nordic contacts. Several witnesses have reported being told directly by Nordic beings that the implant serves as a communication device or location device, that it allows the beings to monitor the witness's physical condition and location. A small number of witnesses report being able to perceive transmissions through their implants, not auditory in the conventional sense, but as direct mental impressions of information or communication that they attribute to their Nordic contacts. Whether this reported function is accurate is impossible to verify, but the existence of the objects themselves, foreign bodies with unusual material composition and integrated biological tissue coating, is a physical fact documented by physicians and confirmed by laboratory analysis that demands explanation. The crashed material evidence is the most sensitive and most inaccessible category of physical evidence. We have already discussed the Grusch testimony and its implications. What can be said in the public domain about material allegedly recovered from non-human craft is limited by classification, but not entirely empty. Researcher Linda Moulton Howe has spent 4 decades documenting cases in which individuals with direct access to classified programs have described recovered materials with physical properties that cannot be replicated by current human technology. Metamaterials with layered structure that enables electromagnetic properties not found in any natural or manufactured material. Metal alloys with memory characteristics that return to original shape after deformation, and in several cases, materials that appear to generate energy without any visible input source. These descriptions are consistent across multiple independent witnesses with no apparent connection to each other, and they are consistent with the descriptions of craft materials that have emerged from the broader body of declassified UFO research. The physical evidence, taken as a whole, is not the kind of evidence that the popular imagination associates with extraordinary claims. No artifact sitting in a museum case, no piece of alien metal available for public examination. What it is a body of documented, analyzed, witnessed physical data that is inconsistent with conventional explanations and consistent with the hypothesis that something of non-human origin has been in contact with Earth. The landing traces, the medical documentation, the implant analyses, the witness testimony of recovered materials. Each strand of evidence is imperfect, but they weave together into a fabric that is harder to dismiss than any single thread, and far stronger than the debunking narrative acknowledges. Proof number 6. Underground bases and secret programs. The hidden infrastructure of contact. The story of Nordic aliens would be incomplete without addressing one of its most contested chapters, the alleged existence of secret underground facilities where contact with non-human beings, including the Nordic type, has been conducted on a sustained basis, hidden from public knowledge and from the oversight of elected government. This is the territory where credible witness testimony shades into the unverifiable, where the evidence is most fragmentary and most easily dismissed, and where the stakes, if the accounts are accurate, are most profound. It is also territory where the documentation is more substantial than the dismissive consensus acknowledges. We begin with the testimony of Phil Schneider. Schneider was a geologist and structural engineer who claimed to have worked for the United States government on the construction of deep underground military bases, a category of installation whose existence is now officially acknowledged, though their precise locations and purposes remain classified. Schneider began making public presentations in 1995, in which he described his work on underground facilities and an incident he claimed had occurred at an underground base near Dulce, New Mexico in 1979, in which he was involved in a firefight with non-human beings encountered during excavation of a new tunnel level. Schneider claimed to have been shot with a beam weapon during this encounter, and he displayed to his audiences a scarring pattern on his chest and hands that he attributed to this injury. In January 1996, Schneider was found dead in his apartment. His death officially ruled a suicide by strangulation, a finding that many researchers and colleagues who knew him found implausible given the physical circumstances and given Schneider's prior statements that he expected to be killed for his disclosures. Schneider's credibility has been extensively debated. Elements of his biography that could be independently verified have checked out. He did work as a geological consultant on government contracts, and his knowledge of underground construction methodology was genuine and detailed. Elements that could not be verified, including his specific claims about the Dulce incident, remain in the realm of unverifiable assertion. But Schneider is not the only source for the Dulce allegations, and the convergence of multiple independent witnesses on a location and a description is evidence in itself. The Dulce, New Mexico facility, sometimes called the Dulce Base or Dulce Underground, has been referenced by multiple witnesses with claimed direct knowledge over a period of decades. The location is in Archuleta County, New Mexico, on land adjacent to the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, in a region that has been associated with a disproportionate number of cattle mutilation cases, a phenomenon that we will not digress into fully here, but that is itself a significant body of evidence suggesting non-human activity in the area. The witnesses who have described the Dulce facility include not only Schneider, but also Thomas Edwin Costello, who claimed to be a former security guard at the facility. Paul Benowitz, an Albuquerque businessman and physicist who conducted electronic surveillance of signals he believed originated from the facility, and who subsequently became the target of a disinformation campaign by Air Force Office of Special Investigations agents, a campaign that has been officially acknowledged, and multiple sources who contacted researchers like William Cooper, John Lear, and the filmmaker Anthony Sanchez independently. The description of the Dulce facility across these independent sources is remarkably consistent. A multi-level underground installation, accessed via elevator and tunnel systems, in which research is conducted on biology, genetics, and interspecies studies. Multiple types of non-human beings are described as present in the facility, including gray types on the upper levels, and, in the most sensitive areas on the deepest levels, beings described as the Nordic type, tall, fair, human-appearing, and in at least some accounts described as interacting with senior human personnel in what appeared to be a collaborative rather than adversarial relationship. Thomas Costello, whose detailed internal diagrams of the facility have been circulated in UFO research circles for decades, described specific levels of the installation with specific functions, including a level 6 called Nightmare Hall by the human personnel, where experiments on biological hybridization were conducted. These accounts are deeply disturbing if accurate. They are deeply problematic to assess without corroborating evidence that remains classified or inaccessible. What can be said with confidence is that the United States government's underground construction program has been vastly larger than most of the public realizes. The existence of a deep underground command facility beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, constructed in the 1960s, is publicly acknowledged. The existence of similar facilities at Raven Rock Mountain in Pennsylvania, Mount Weather in Virginia, and Site R, various emergency continuity of government facilities designed to ensure the survival of federal government in the event of nuclear attack, is publicly acknowledged. The construction of these facilities required the services of geologists, engineers, and security personnel who signed non-disclosure agreements of extraordinary depth and who were compartmentalized to a degree that prevented any individual from understanding the full scope of what they were building. The infrastructure for secret underground construction of significant scale was unambiguously real. The question is whether it was used exclusively for human governmental purposes, or whether some portion of it accommodated activities that its planners felt necessary to keep not only from the public, but from most of the government itself. The base connection to Nordic beings specifically comes through a different thread of the evidence. Multiple witnesses who describe ongoing contact with Nordic beings, contactees who experience not a single encounter but a long-term relationship with their Nordic contacts, have described being taken to locations that they describe as underground or underwater facilities that appeared to be of non-human construction. These descriptions appear in the accounts of Howard Menger, who described being shown an installation beneath a mountain that he could not locate on any map. They appear in the accounts of William Hamilton, a researcher who collected testimony from multiple sources in the Dulce area and who himself reported anomalous electronic experiences in the region. They appear in the accounts of several individuals who came forward after the Grush disclosure, describing having been taken to or shown facilities that operated beyond the oversight of standard military command structure and that included both human and non-human personnel. The relationship between Nordic beings and what might be called the Deep Program, the network of secret programs that exists beneath the level of elected governmental oversight, is, according to the most credible witnesses, fundamentally different from the relationship between the program and the Grey type. Multiple sources describe the Greys as having been involved in the program through a form of negotiated agreement, an arrangement often described by witnesses as a treaty or exchange, in which specific forms of access to human beings were granted in exchange for technology. The Nordic beings, by contrast, are described by witnesses as operating either in opposition to this arrangement, warning human officials about the dangers of the treaty relationship, or as operating entirely outside the program structure, engaging with individual humans on their own terms and for their own purposes rather than through the institutional relationship. This distinction between the institutionalized extraterrestrial relationship that forms the backbone of the Deep Program's alleged structure and the independent Nordic contact phenomenon is one of the most consistently reported elements of the testimony from inside the programs. Witnesses who describe both types describe a categorical difference in the nature of the interaction. The program relationship is described in transactional terms. The Nordic interaction is described in terms that witness after witness reaches for spiritual or emotional language to express, as a relationship characterized by something that functions like genuine concern for human well-being, in contrast to what witnesses describe as the unsettling indifference of the Grey type. There is also a connection between the Nordic presence and a specific historical chapter that has been the subject of serious historical research independent of any UFO context: Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was the United States program, conducted in the immediate aftermath of World War II, that recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had been associated with the Nazi regime to varying degrees, and brought them to the United States to work in military and aerospace research programs. The program is not controversial in its existence. It is thoroughly documented, and the biographical records of many paperclip scientists are publicly available. What is more contested is the claim, made by multiple researchers, that among the technological and research materials transferred to the United States through Operation Paperclip were documents and artifacts related to the German program's own contact with non-human intelligence, a program associated with the secretive SS organization known as the Ahnenerbe. The Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization devoted to research into German racial and cultural heritage, which over time evolved into a vehicle for various forms of occult and pseudoscientific research, was, according to several sources, involved in research that went well beyond the folklorist and archaeological projects it officially pursued. Multiple witnesses and researchers have described the Ahnenerbe as having been in possession of, or having made contact with, extraterrestrial technology or extraterrestrial beings, with the Nordic type specifically because the Nazi ideology of Aryan racial superiority created a cultural framework in which tall, blonde, fair beings were associated with the ultimate ideal of racial development. And because the Nazi leadership's documented obsession with the occult and with what they called higher races extended, according to some accounts, to actual contact with beings they interpreted through the lens of their racial ideology. The researcher Joseph P. Farrell has documented, in a series of scholarly works based on archival research, the existence of advanced aerospace development programs within the Nazi state that produced craft with capabilities that exceeded anything the Allied powers expected Germany to be capable of developing. Whether or not the Ahnenerbe contact claims are accurate, the technological inheritance of Operation Paperclip is unambiguously real, and the technologies brought to the United States through that program, rocket propulsion, aerospace design, behavioral science, formed the basis of American aerospace dominance in the post-war period. If among those technologies were any related to non-human contact, they would have been incorporated into exactly the kind of deep, compartmentalized program that the witness testimony describes. Programs too sensitive for normal oversight, too anomalous for conventional institutional frameworks, and too consequential for the public to be allowed to engage with them on their own terms. The underground base hypothesis that a significant portion of the contact between human institutional actors and Nordic beings has occurred in installations hidden from ordinary governmental oversight is not proven by the available evidence, but it is supported by a convergence of witness testimony from individuals who have no connection to each other, who describe consistent physical environments and consistent character of the beings they encountered, and who in several cases have demonstrated knowledge of genuine classified programs or genuine physical environments that they had no legitimate means of accessing. It is supported by the known reality of the deep underground construction program, which provided the physical infrastructure for such facilities, and it is supported by the consistent description, in both contactee testimony and in leaked program testimony, of a relationship between Nordic beings and humanity that is deeper, older, and more deliberate than a series of casual encounters would suggest. Proof number 7, genetic and biological evidence. The DNA anomalies, blood type mysteries, and morphological evidence. Of all the proofs in this investigation, the genetic evidence is simultaneously the most scientifically grounded and the most incomplete. It is grounded because it rests on empirical biological data that can be independently verified and reanalyzed. It is incomplete because the full analysis required to draw definitive conclusions from this data has not yet been conducted, and in some cases, the data itself is contested or unavailable for public examination. But the existing evidence is sufficient to establish that something anomalous is present in human biology, something that has no satisfactory conventional explanation, and that is consistent with the hypothesis of long-term genetic interaction between humanity and an external, non-human intelligence. We begin with the Rh factor. The Rh blood group system, named for the rhesus monkey, in whose blood the relevant antigen was first identified, divides human beings into two broad categories. Rh positive, in which the Rh factor antigen is present on the surface of red blood cells, and Rh negative, in which it is absent. Approximately 85% of the world's population is Rh positive. The remaining 15% are Rh negative. This distribution is not uniform across human populations. Certain populations have markedly higher rates of Rh negativity than others. The Basque people of northern Spain and southern France have the highest rate of Rh negativity of any population on Earth, approaching 30% or more, depending on the specific community. Other populations with elevated Rh negativity rates include certain populations of the British Isles, the Berber peoples of North Africa, and certain Native American groups. The global distribution of Rh negativity is uneven in a way that conventional population genetics has not fully explained. The mystery of the Rh factor has two dimensions. First, it is the only medically significant blood incompatibility in mammals that involves a conflict between a mother and her own offspring. Rh negative mothers who carry Rh positive babies can develop what is called Rh sensitization, an immune response in which the mother's immune system treats the baby's Rh positive blood cells as a foreign invader, potentially causing hemolytic disease of the newborn in subsequent pregnancies. This kind of maternal-fetal conflict is extraordinarily unusual in nature because it represents a failure of the biological cooperation that evolution normally optimizes for. The immune system is designed to protect the individual from external threats, not to attack the individual's own offspring. The existence of a maternal-fetal blood incompatibility suggests to researchers who have examined this question that the Rh-negative trait did not originate within the main line of human biological development, but was introduced either through mutation or through genetic admixture with a population that did not carry the Rh antigen and whose blood was therefore incompatible with the existing human blood type in the way that cross-species blood is incompatible. The second dimension of the Rh mystery is the distribution of associated physical characteristics. Multiple researchers, including the biologist David Alvarez, have noted that Rh-negative individuals tend to cluster around a specific set of physical and physiological characteristics: higher than average IQ scores, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic frequencies, greater than average incidence of reported psychic or intuitive experiences, and, crucially, a physical type that tends toward fair skin, blue or green eyes, and light hair color. This phenotype, which is, of course, the Nordic type, is not universally associated with Rh negativity, but the correlation is statistically significant enough to have been noted by multiple independent researchers. The implication, pursued by researchers in the alternative genetics field, is that the Rh-negative trait entered the human population through an admixture event with a population whose full biological profile matches the Nordic encounter description: fair-skinned, light-eyed, blonde-haired, and carrying a blood antigen profile distinct from the majority of humanity. This is not a claim that Rh-negative individuals are alien. It is a claim supported by the convergence of genetic distribution, associated physical type, and the biological anomaly of maternal-fetal incompatibility that the Rh-negative trait has an origin that is not fully accounted for by the standard model of human biological development, and that this origin is consistent with a genetic contribution from a population whose physical characteristics match the Nordic encounter description. The discovery in 2010 that Homo sapiens carries a significant genetic inheritance from Neanderthals, approximately 1 to 4% of the genome of non-African populations, fundamentally changed the academic consensus on human genetics and on the question of interbreeding between distinct hominid species. Where the consensus had previously held that modern humans replaced Neanderthals without significant genetic exchange, the evidence of widespread interbreeding between the two populations forced a revision. This revision opened the door, at least in principle, to the question of whether the genetic legacy of modern humans includes contributions not merely from other hominid species that evolved on Earth, but from populations of biological origin beyond Earth. The Neanderthal admixture was invisible to researchers until the technology to identify it became available. The Nordic admixture hypothesis proposes that a similar contribution, smaller perhaps, but biologically significant, may be present in the human genome, identifiable in the distribution of certain traits but invisible to the analytical frameworks that are not looking for it. The Starchild skull, discovered in Mexico in the early 20th century and subjected to extensive genetic analysis beginning in the 1990s, is one of the most analyzed and most contested pieces of biological evidence in the alternative research field. The skull, acquired by researcher Lloyd Pye in the late 1990s, exhibits a morphology significantly different from normal human skulls. The cranium is dramatically enlarged relative to the facial area, the orbit of the eyes is shallower than normal, and several structural features are unlike anything in the known human skeletal record. The skull has been subjected to DNA analysis at multiple independent laboratories, with results that have proven deeply contentious. Initial analyses in the 1990s found evidence of nuclear DNA that did not match the full human pattern. A 2011 analysis using next-generation sequencing found sequences that appeared to match human nuclear DNA, which has been cited by skeptics as proof that the skull is simply an unusual human specimen. But Pye and other researchers argue that the 2011 results are themselves ambiguous. that the sequences identified are from nuclear DNA, which exists in every cell and can be contaminated from environmental sources, while the mitochondrial DNA of the specimen, which is more specific to lineage, has shown patterns inconsistent with fully human origin. The star child skull case is unresolved. It is neither proof of hybrid biology nor definitively explained by the human deformity hypothesis. The elongated skull phenomenon presents a broader and more extensively documented biological mystery. Across multiple geographic regions, Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, Malta, Mexico, and several Pacific Island cultures, archaeological sites have yielded human or near-human skulls with dramatically elongated cranial vaults. Some of these elongations are clearly the result of artificial cranial binding, a practice documented in multiple cultures in which the skulls of infants are bound during the period of skull growth to produce a characteristic elongated shape. But a subset of the elongated skulls do not show the characteristics of artificial binding. They show structural differences from normally formed human skulls that go beyond the superficial. A parietal plate structure that is absent or dramatically reduced, a cranial capacity significantly larger than the normal human range, and in some cases, anomalous numbers of cranial plates that do not match the normal human skeletal pattern. Brian Furster, a researcher who has spent years studying the Paracas culture skulls of Peru, has documented these skeletal anomalies in detail and has arranged for DNA analysis of several specimens. The results, reported in 2018, indicated that the mitochondrial DNA of several Paracas elongated skull specimens did not match any known human population and contained mutations unknown in any modern human. The findings were preliminary. The samples were processed by a private laboratory rather than a peer-reviewed academic institution, and the results have not been replicated or confirmed through the academic peer review process. But they are consistent with what you would expect to find if these individuals were biological hybrids between human beings and a population with a distinctly different genetic profile. The elongated skull individuals, wherever they have been found, appear to have been of high social status. They are associated with exceptional craftsmanship, advanced astronomical knowledge, and in several cases with cultural traditions that describe their ancestors as having come from the sky. The Paracas culture of coastal Peru produced some of the finest textiles in pre-Columbian America and demonstrated an astronomical sophistication that is difficult to explain by conventional accounts of Andean cultural development. The Guanche people of the Canary Islands, several of whose mummies show elongated cranial structures, maintain traditions describing their origin as descendants of beings who came from a land beyond the ocean or beyond the sky. The common thread across these cultures is not merely the biological anomaly of the skull morphology, it is the associated cultural claim of descent from sky beings, from beings who came from outside the earth and who contributed to the founding of the civilization. The genetic investigation of human origins has produced a series of anomalies that the standard model of human evolution struggles to accommodate. The sequencing of the human genome revealed that approximately 8% of it consists of endogenous retrovirus sequences, viral DNA that has been incorporated into the genome through infection events in our evolutionary past. Of this 8%, a significant portion is of origin that cannot be matched to any known terrestrial retrovirus. It sits in the genome as what geneticists call junk DNA, non-coding sequences that appear to have no function. Some researchers in the alternative genetics field propose that these unidentified sequences are not the legacy of ancient infection by terrestrial viruses, but of genetic modification events using viral vectors, a technology that modern genetic engineering employs and that an advanced civilization could have mastered far beyond our current capability. Among these non-coding sequences are regulatory elements, sequences that do not themselves code for proteins, but that influence the expression of protein-coding genes. Certain regulatory sequences unique to humans, absent in chimpanzees and other great apes, have been found to cluster around genes associated with brain development, with neural plasticity, and with the kind of rapid cognitive expansion that characterizes the distinguishing features of modern human intelligence. The conventional evolutionary explanation for these regulatory changes is natural selection, that random mutations in regulatory regions, if they conferred significant survival advantage, would be selected for over time. But the pace and the specificity of the changes, and the fact that they cluster around cognitive function rather than being distributed randomly across the genome, has led some researchers to question whether natural selection alone is a sufficient explanation or whether the pattern is more consistent with deliberate modification. This is the question at the heart of the genetic proof. Is the human genome the product of purely natural evolutionary processes, or does it contain evidence of deliberate modification by an intelligence operating from outside the normal evolutionary framework? The evidence does not yet permit a definitive answer, but the evidence, the Rh factor distribution, the Neanderthal admixture precedent, the Starchild skull DNA results, the Paracas skull DNA results, the unidentified retroviral sequences, the regulatory gene clustering, is not consistent with the hypothesis that human biology is exactly what conventional evolutionary theory would predict. Something has been done to human biology that conventional evolutionary theory did not do. The question is what and by whom, and the answer that the full body of evidence points toward is not a comfortable one. Proof number 8. Modern contact cases, post-2000 encounters and the evolving relationship. The UFO research field entered the 21st century in a paradoxical condition. On one hand, the cultural mainstream had never been more saturated with extraterrestrial imagery. Films, television series, video games, and internet culture had made the alien a ubiquitous cultural figure, available as a reference frame for virtually any experience a witness might have. On the other hand, the explosion of recording technology, cheap cameras, smartphones with video capability, dash cams, doorbell cameras, and ultimately satellites and military sensor arrays capable of capturing aerial phenomena in unprecedented detail had made the environment for genuine evidence gathering dramatically better than it had ever been. The result is a complex picture, more report volume, more environmental noise, more opportunity for fabrication, and simultaneously more high-quality evidence than has ever existed before. Within this complex picture, the Nordic encounter continues to appear with a frequency and a consistency that is remarkable given the cultural saturation with the gray alien type. Witnesses who encounter Nordic beings in the post-2000 era are not describing the beings they expect to see. They are describing beings who are unexpected, who do not match the culturally dominant alien image, and whose description requires the witness to grapple with the possibility that what they encountered is real rather than a projection of familiar cultural content. This unexpected quality of the Nordic encounter, the fact that witnesses are surprised to encounter something human appearing rather than something alien appearing, is itself a form of evidence for the independence of the experience from cultural contamination. We will examine a series of post-2000 Nordic encounter cases that exemplify the characteristics of the modern encounter wave, chosen for their documentation quality, the credibility of the witnesses, and the physical or corroborating evidence available. The case of pilot Paulo Ney is one of the most comprehensively documented aviation encounters in the modern UFO literature. Ney, a commercial airline pilot with extensive flight experience, was flying a commercial route over Brazil in 2004 when he observed a craft at close range that tracked his aircraft for an extended period. The encounter was observed by co-pilots and subsequently by ground radar that recorded the presence of an unidentified object in the airspace consistent with Ney's report. What distinguishes the Ney case from a simple craft sighting is what Ney subsequently reported to investigators, that during the encounter he observed through the craft's transparent sections the outline of at least two figures in the interior, figures he described as upright, human in posture, and, insofar as he could determine at the distance involved, apparently normal in proportion, not small and hunched in the manner of the gray type. Upright, apparently human in scale. The European encounter wave of the early 2000s produced several cases of extraordinary documentary quality. In 2004, an Italian researcher named Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, who had himself been involved in one of the most physically detailed encounter cases of the 1970s, received testimony from a witness he identifies only as MR, a farmer from the Lombardy region of northern Italy who described a series of encounters with beings he described in terms that matched the Nordic profile almost precisely. The witness described 3 meetings over a period of 4 months, in which beings he described as approximately 6 feet 3 inches in height, with fair skin, blue eyes, and hair of a platinum blonde color so light it appeared almost white, approached him in his fields. They communicated in Italian, accent-free. They asked him questions about his agricultural practices, his knowledge of the local water table, and his understanding of the soil chemistry of the region. They observed him working without apparent hostility or alarm, and on the 3rd encounter, one of the beings placed a hand on the witness's shoulder and communicated what the witness described as a direct mental impression of calm and reassurance, following which the being indicated through gesture that their meetings were concluded. The encounters ended. The witness reported no further contact. He experienced no particular anxiety about the meetings and described them in terms of puzzlement rather than fear. The lack of dramatic or apocalyptic content, the mundane agricultural focus of the being's apparent interest, is itself a detail that argues against fabrication, since a fabricated account would almost certainly have provided more spectacular content. The Krennikov Forest encounter of 2009 is among the most thoroughly documented modern Nordic encounters in the Russian language literature. The encounter occurred near the town of Krennikov in the Voronezh region of Russia, an area that had previously attracted UFO attention in 1989 when a reported landing in a city park in Voronezh was covered by the Soviet news agency TASS in a report that attracted international attention precisely because it came from an official Soviet news organization and described beings of approximately 3 meters in height, significantly taller than any human being. The 2009 case involves not a TASS report, but a civilian witness, a middle-aged man who was hiking in the forest when he encountered a figure standing in a clearing. The figure, as subsequently described to investigators from a regional Russian UFO research organization, was male in apparent gender, approximately 6 feet 5 inches in height, with light blonde hair worn to the shoulders, pale skin, and blue eyes. The being was wearing clothing that the witness described as resembling a gray-blue bodysuit. It stood completely still as the witness approached along the forest path. When the witness stopped, approximately 15 meters from the being turned to face him directly, and the witness described experiencing an overwhelming wave of calm and a sense of profound benevolence. The same emotional impact reported by witnesses across the encounter literature, across cultures, across decades. The being observed the witness for what the witness estimated as approximately 2 minutes, then turned and walked into the trees, disappearing without any sound or ground disturbance. The witness found, at the point where the being had been standing, a circular depression in the forest floor approximately 2 feet in diameter, where the vegetation had been pressed flat, though no subsequent chemical or physical analysis was conducted. The North American modern encounter literature contains several cases of particular significance. The case documented by researcher Mary Rodwell, an Australian clinical hypnotherapist and nurse who has worked with over 3,000 individuals claiming contact experiences, demonstrates the demographic breadth of the modern Nordic encounter. Rodwell's casework includes multiple individuals in Australia, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom who have independently described encounters with beings matching the Nordic type under hypnotic regression in ways that produce consistent descriptive details the witnesses could not have coordinated. Rodwell has noted in her published work that the Nordic encounter consistently differs from the Gray encounter in its emotional and psychological character. Witnesses of Gray encounters typically report anxiety, fear, helplessness, and a sense of violation. Witnesses of Nordic encounters consistently report calm, benevolence, a sense of being recognized and valued, and in many cases a sense of significance, a feeling that they were chosen or contacted for a specific reason, and that their encounters are part of a larger pattern of which they are not yet fully aware. This consistency of emotional response across witnesses who have not communicated with each other and who in many cases are not affiliated with the UFO research community is evidence of a particular type. It is not evidence of physical reality in the direct material sense, but it is evidence against the hypothesis that these accounts are culturally contaminated confabulations, because culturally contaminated accounts tend to reflect the emotional valence that the contaminating culture assigns to the phenomenon. In a culture where the alien is associated with danger and invasion, the prevailing cultural narrative for the past century, a contaminated account would be expected to carry anxiety and threat. Nordic encounter accounts consistently do not. They carry calm and benevolence and a quality that witnesses struggle to describe, but that several independent witnesses have characterized as love, a word that seems absurd in the context of an encounter with a non-human entity until you realize that it appears in the accounts of a mechanic in Nevada in 1952, and a farmer in Lombardy in 2004, and a hiker in Russia in 2009, and a nurse in Brisbane in 2017, none of whom have any connection to each other. The message content of modern Nordic encounters is, in its broad themes, entirely consistent with the message content of the 1950s encounters. The nuclear weapons concern remains prominent. Indeed, it has intensified. Multiple post-2000 Nordic contact accounts include specific references to the development and deployment of new generations of nuclear weapons, to the relationship between nuclear technology and what the beings describe as a fragility of the fabric of reality that human technology is approaching. Environmental destruction appears as a new or newly prominent theme. The Nordics of modern accounts express concerns about what humanity is doing to the biosphere that were not as prominent in the early contact literature, which is consistent with the catastrophic acceleration of environmental destruction that has occurred since the 1950s. There is also a new theme in modern Nordic contact accounts that is perhaps the most significant and the most difficult to assess: the theme of urgency. The beings of modern Nordic encounters are described consistently as communicating a sense that something is coming, a threshold, a change, a crisis, or transformation, and that the timeline is shorter than it has ever been. Witnesses describe this not as a message of doom, but as a message of alarm combined with encouragement, as if a mentor were telling a student that the exam is tomorrow and the student needs to focus. The content of what is coming varies in the details of individual accounts, but clusters around a convergent set of themes: a period of significant global disruption, a possibility of breakthrough to a qualitatively different level of human consciousness and organization, and the presence of forces, both human and non-human, that are working to prevent that breakthrough from occurring. The Nordics, in these modern accounts, appear to be on the side of the breakthrough. The consistency of this message across modern Nordic encounters, across the tens of thousands of miles that separate witnesses, across the language barriers that divide them, across the cultural differences that would be expected to produce divergent content if the accounts were culturally generated, is the most compelling single feature of the modern contact wave. It is not what witnesses expect to experience. It is not what the culture they inhabit would predict. It is instead precisely what you would expect to find if the same intelligence were communicating the same genuine concern to a series of human beings selected for some reason the witnesses themselves cannot fully articulate. That intelligence knows what is coming. It is trying to tell us, and the record of its attempts to communicate, spanning 7 decades of documented modern encounters and thousands of years of encoded mythological record, constitutes a message of extraordinary scope delivered through the only channels available to it: the minds and bodies of the human beings who are willing to be surprised. Proof Nur 9: The Nordic Agenda. Why they come, what they want, and what they're building toward. Every intelligence has a purpose. Every intelligence that invests resources in a sustained activity does so because the activity serves something, a goal, a value, a necessity. The Nordic beings, if the accumulated evidence of 7,000 years of human encounter accounts is to be taken seriously, have invested an extraordinary amount of sustained effort in contact with humanity. The question of why, what purpose drives this sustained investment, is the question that researchers and witnesses have been grappling with since the beginning of the modern contact era, and it is the question whose answer, if it can be arrived at, tells us most about the nature of what we are dealing with and most about our own situation in the cosmos. The message content of Nordic encounters, which we have examined across multiple proofs, provides the most direct access to the answer. But the message content alone is insufficient to understand the agenda. It tells us what the Nordics say their concerns are. It does not necessarily tell us what their actual objectives are, because any intelligence capable of sustained interstellar travel and sustained contact with a less advanced species is capable of managing the content of its communications to serve its own purposes. The question of Nordic agenda requires us to examine not only what they say, but what they do, the pattern of their behavior across the full sweep of the encounter evidence, and to see whether the saying and the doing align. The most consistent behavioral pattern in the Nordic encounter literature is observation. Across thousands of documented accounts, the Nordics observe. They watch agricultural practices. They observe military installations. They monitor nuclear sites. They study human beings at their most ordinary, plowing fields, hiking in forests, driving on country roads. The observation is sustained, systematic, and apparently global. Every inhabited region of the Earth has produced Nordic encounter accounts that include this quality of being watched, being studied, being assessed. This is the behavior of a species that is gathering data, and gathering it with a patience and a scope that suggests the data collection has been going on for a very long time. The second consistent behavioral pattern is communication. The Nordics do not merely watch. At certain thresholds, at moments of particular significance, with individuals who seem to have been specifically selected, they communicate. The communication is not random or exploratory. It has consistent content, consistent tone, and consistent urgency. It is the communication of beings who have something specific to say and who are choosing their moments and their recipients carefully. The consistency of the message content across vastly different witnesses and vastly different contexts suggests that the communication is not improvised or individual, but is coordinated, that the same message is being delivered by multiple beings to multiple recipients across the globe as part of a systematic program. The third behavioral pattern is intervention at specific thresholds. The nuclear weapons connection is the most extensively documented instance of this. The pattern of UFO activity in the vicinity of nuclear weapons installations, nuclear test sites, and nuclear-armed military forces has been noted by researchers, documented in declassified military reports, and attested by credible military witnesses for decades. Whatever the Nordics' ultimate agenda, the behavior of the beings most closely associated with nuclear installations is not merely observational, it is interactive. The deactivation of nuclear missiles, the flight over test sites at moments of testing, the consistent appearance of UFOs above nuclear-armed submarines and carriers. This is not passive observation. It is active engagement with human nuclear capability in ways that suggest the capability is of more than academic interest. The most coherent interpretation of these three behavioral patterns, observation, communication, intervention at specific thresholds, is that the Nordics are engaged in something that might be called a management program, not in the benign sense of a helpful administrator, and not in the sinister sense of a puppet master controlling humanity for its own benefit. In the functional sense of a civilization that has defined a set of conditions under which it will allow a neighboring, less advanced species to develop autonomously, and a set of conditions that will trigger direct intervention. The development of nuclear weapons, apparently, crosses one of those thresholds. The large-scale destruction of the planetary biosphere may be crossing another. And whatever is coming, the threshold that modern Nordic contact accounts describe with increasing urgency may represent the ultimate threshold, the moment at which autonomous human development either succeeds or fails in a way that has consequences beyond Earth. This management hypothesis is disturbing in its implications. It means that humanity is not the autonomous, self-determining species it has assumed itself to be. It means that decisions of existential importance, decisions about what humanity is allowed to do with itself and its planet, have been made or are being made by an intelligence outside humanity's awareness, operating under rules that humanity has never agreed to and was never consulted about. It is, in essence, the hypothesis that humanity is subject to a form of governance that it is not aware of and did not consent to. The response to this hypothesis ranges from outrage, who gave them the right, to relief, someone else is paying attention, to a more nuanced position that recognizes the parallel in human civilization itself. The governance of less powerful communities by more powerful ones is a fundamental feature of human political history, and has not always been catastrophic, and has occasionally been beneficial, even when consent was not obtained. But the management hypothesis is not the only framework that fits the evidence. An alternative framework, one that several researchers and many witnesses find more resonant with the actual character of the encounter accounts, is the kinship hypothesis. The kinship hypothesis proposes that the Nordic beings are not merely managing a neighboring species. They are, in some biological and historical sense, continuous with humanity. They are what humanity was, or will be, or might be. They are the elder branch of a family that includes both them and us, separated by time and by development, but not by fundamental nature. They are here not as managers, but as kin, as relatives who have watched a younger member of the family struggle and succeed and fail and struggle again, and who intervene not from a sense of external governance, but from a sense of connection that is prior to and more fundamental than any political or strategic calculation. This kinship hypothesis is consistent with several specific elements of the encounter evidence that are difficult to explain in any other framework. The emotional impact of Nordic encounters, the overwhelming sense of recognition, of familiarity, of love that witnesses consistently describe, is not what you would expect from contact with a management entity operating from strategic interest. It is what you would expect from contact with something that genuinely cares about you in a way that feels personal rather than institutional. The physical similarity between Nordic beings and human beings, a similarity so close that the Nordics can pass as human in contemporary society, is not what you would expect from a species that evolved independently on another planet over billions of years. It is what you would expect from a species with a common biological heritage, diverged at some point in the past through separation or modification, but retaining the fundamental biological template that connects us. The message content supports the kinship hypothesis in a specific way. The Nordics do not communicate warnings about nuclear weapons and environmental destruction as if from the outside, as if an alien species with no stake in the matter were offering a disinterested assessment of humanity's risks. They communicate as if they have a stake in the outcome, as if humanity's success or failure matters to them personally, specifically in a way that goes beyond strategic interest. As if what happens to us happens, in some sense, to them. This is the communication pattern of kin, not of managers. A third framework, perhaps the most challenging but not the least credible, is the evolutionary framework. This hypothesis proposes that the Nordic beings are not managing humanity from outside and are not kin to humanity in the sense of shared biological heritage. They are instead what humanity is in the process of becoming, future humans or beings from a parallel evolutionary line whose development has preceded ours, who are here because they understand that what happens to humanity at this juncture is causally connected to what they are and where they came from. This is the time travel hypothesis in its most sophisticated form, and it is the framework that some of the most intellectually serious researchers in the field, including Jacques Vallée, who has spent 50 years developing a nuanced, scientifically grounded approach to the phenomenon, find most internally consistent with the full body of evidence. The evolutionary framework would explain the physical similarity between Nordics and humans without requiring either common ancestry or parallel evolution on another planet. It would explain the emotional depth of the connection that witnesses describe, the recognition and the love, as the response of an entity that is, in a meaningful sense, looking at itself. It would explain the consistent focus of the Nordic message on human development, human consciousness, and human choices at this particular moment in history, because from the perspective of a being that came from this moment, or that is connected to this moment across time, the choices made now are not merely historically significant, they are foundationally significant. They are the choices from which everything that comes after proceeds. What is the Nordic agenda? The most honest answer is, we do not know with certainty. The evidence permits several coherent hypotheses, each of which is supported by significant evidence, and each of which carries profound implications for humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. What the evidence does not permit is the conclusion that the Nordics have no agenda, that their sustained, consistent, apparently coordinated engagement with humanity across thousands of years is purposeless or accidental. Whatever they are here for, they are here deliberately, with patience that exceeds anything in the human experiential framework, and with an investment in the outcome that goes beyond what purely strategic management would require. They have an agenda, and the direction that agenda points toward human survival, human development, human consciousness expansion is the most hopeful direction the evidence could possibly point. Proof. Record 10. They are already among us. The infiltration hypothesis, walk-ins, and the Nordic integration program. The most alarming of the 10 proofs is also the most difficult to document and the most easy to dismiss. It is the claim, made by multiple credible witnesses, supported by a surprisingly substantial body of circumstantial evidence, and consistent with the logic of the broader Nordic encounter phenomenon, that Nordic beings are not only visiting Earth, they are living on it, among us, undetected. They walk our cities, work in our institutions, interact with our populations, and move through human society in human-appearing bodies that are either genuinely biological and nearly indistinguishable from human, or are capable of appearing so through means that the encounter literature associates with a sophisticated capacity for physical mimicry or holographic projection. This is the hypothesis that sounds most like science fiction. It is also the hypothesis that fits most elegantly with the body of evidence we have assembled across the previous 9 proofs. If Nordic beings are here with a sustained agenda, whether that agenda is management, kinship, or evolutionary investment, and if they have the technological capability to visit Earth at will and to interact with human beings undetected when they choose, then the most efficient implementation of any sustained agenda would involve the placement of beings within human society in positions from which the agenda could be most effectively advanced. Not hovering in craft above nuclear silos, not meeting selected contactees in desert fields, living among us, working within our institutions, influencing our culture, our science, our political structures from the inside. The evidence for this hypothesis comes from several directions. The first is direct witness testimony from individuals who describe being told by their Nordic contacts that the beings have operatives who live among human populations in a form indistinguishable from human. This claim appears in the Billy Meyer contact records, in which Semjase reportedly described a program of observation conducted by Plejaren individuals living in human society, dressed as humans, participating in human economic and social life, for the purpose of gathering direct observational data on human civilization. Meyer's account of this is detailed and internally consistent, and it appears in his recorded transmissions from the 1970s, before the concept of alien infiltration of human society had been elaborated in popular culture to the degree that a culturally contaminated account would be expected to reflect. The same claim appears in the accounts of Sixto Paz Wells, the Peruvian researcher whose contact experiences we briefly discussed in Part 4. Wells's contacts described a program of incarnation, a process by which Plejaren souls or consciousnesses could be born into human bodies, living entirely human lives while retaining, at some level of awareness, a connection to their Plejaren origin. This is the concept that in the New Age and spiritual communities has come to be called the walk-in and the starseed, beings of non-human origin who incarnate into human bodies for the purpose of contributing to human spiritual development and evolutionary advancement. The New Age community's embrace of this concept has made it difficult to treat in the UFO research context with the seriousness it may deserve, because it has been associated with uncritical belief systems and with the kind of unverifiable personal mythology that is easy to dismiss. But the concept itself, that beings of non-human origin could inhabit human bodies, is not inherently less credible than other aspects of the Nordic encounter hypothesis. It is, in fact, a logical extension of the genetic and biological evidence we examined in Part 8. If Nordic beings and human beings share sufficient biological heritage that interbreeding is possible, then the gap between the two forms may not be as large as it appears from the outside. The testimony of Sergeant Clifford Stone, whom we discussed in Part 5, adds another dimension to the infiltration hypothesis. Stone, in his extensive public testimony from the Disclosure Project and subsequent interviews, describes being informed by classified program personnel that some of the non-human beings encountered in the programs were indistinguishable from humans by external observation and required specific medical or physiological examination to identify as non-human. Stone states that he personally interacted with at least one individual in a classified context who was subsequently identified to him as non-human, and that this identification surprised him because the individual's appearance and behavior had given him no indication of non-human origin. Stone is careful in his public testimony not to describe what the distinguishing physiological markers are, stating that this information remains classified, but the claim that such markers exist and that the examination process is necessary, that non-human beings in human form cannot be identified by appearance alone, is itself a significant piece of testimony. The question of what physical characteristics might distinguish a Nordic being living in human society from a genuine human being is addressed indirectly in the encounter literature. Witnesses who have been in close, extended contact with Nordic beings consistently note several qualities that fall just outside the normal human range. The skin quality is often described as slightly different from normal human skin, smoother, slightly more uniform in color, without the texture variations of normal human skin. The eye quality is frequently described as unusually deep or unusually calm, not the restlessness of normal human eyes, which make constant micro-movements, but a stillness of gaze that registers as unusual even before the witness can articulate why. The movement quality is described as slightly too fluid, slightly too controlled, without the habitual physical inefficiencies that characterize human movement. And the emotional register is described as unusual, not flat or robotic, but characterized by a quality of genuine calm and genuine benevolence that exceeds the normal human range in ways that feel uncanny rather than reassuring. These are subtle differences. They are not the kind of differences that would allow for reliable identification across a brief encounter in a public setting. They are the kind of differences that emerge only in extended interaction and only to observers who are looking for them and who have sufficient sensitivity to detect them, which is precisely what you would expect if the being in question had been designed, biologically or technologically, to pass as human in most circumstances. The historical record contains several figures whose accounts and capabilities have led researchers to propose them as candidates for Nordic origin or Nordic influence. This is, obviously, territory fraught with projection and motivated reasoning, and we will navigate it carefully. We are not claiming that any specific historical figure was a Nordic alien. We are noting that the pattern of exceptional intellectual or spiritual insight, anomalous physical characteristics, and a sense of mission or purpose that exceeds ordinary human motivation, the pattern that characterizes the most exceptional human beings in history, is consistent with what the infiltration hypothesis would predict, without constituting proof of it. What is more tractable than historical speculation is the systematic documentation of contemporary individuals who, on the basis of multiple independent witness observations, exhibit the cluster of characteristics associated with Nordic encounter descriptions in ways that are statistically unusual. This documentation has been attempted by several researchers, most notably by researcher Mary Rodwell, who in her clinical work has encountered multiple individuals who present not merely as having had contact experiences, but as believing themselves to be of partial or full Nordic origin. Rodwell approaches these cases with psychological rigor. She distinguishes between individuals who are constructing a narrative for psychological reasons and those whose accounts are consistent, whose physical and behavioral characteristics are unusual in ways they cannot account for, and whose information content goes beyond what could be generated from cultural materials. In her published work, she describes multiple cases in which individuals exhibit physiological characteristics, blood type anomalies, unusual electromagnetic sensitivity, specific visual or auditory sensory characteristics that are not explicable by known genetic or developmental factors, and that cluster in the way the Nordic encounter literature would predict. The concept of an active Nordic integration program, a deliberate, systematic effort to place Nordic beings within human society for the purpose of advancing an agenda, raises profound ethical and political questions. It implies that a portion of human society has been engaged in this program without consent of the broader human community and without knowledge of the human institutions that are supposed to be responsible for the management of human affairs. It implies a degree of influence over human culture and human institutions that most people would find disturbing if they became aware of it. And it implies that the question of who is human, a question that has been politically fraught within humanity's own history, may be even more complex than even the most radical humanist thought has imagined. But the infiltration hypothesis, disturbing as it is, also carries the most hopeful implication of the entire body of evidence we have examined. If Nordic beings are already among us, living in human bodies, participating in human life, contributing to human culture and human development, then the integration of humanity into a broader cosmic community is not a future event waiting to happen. It is already happening. It is happening in the libraries where Nordic-influenced minds are generating the ideas that will change human understanding. It is happening in the laboratories where unusually gifted scientists are producing insights that push the frontier of human knowledge in directions the encounter literature has been predicting for decades. It is happening in the meeting rooms where leaders who feel driven by a sense of purpose they cannot fully explain are making choices that, viewed from a long enough temporal perspective, consistently bend the arc of human civilization toward the outcome the Nordic message has been describing since George Adamski walked into the California desert in 1952. The most radical version of the infiltration hypothesis, and the one that the full body of evidence, taken seriously, points toward, is that the Nordic integration program has been underway for a very long time. Not decades, not centuries, but millennia. Since the moment, described in the ancient record of every major human civilization, when beings of luminous beauty descended from the sky and gave humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine. That moment was not the beginning of human existence, but it may have been the beginning of the human experiment, as the Nordics understand it. An experiment in guided development, in managed emergence, in the careful cultivation of a species through the most dangerous periods of its adolescence, toward a maturity that will allow it to take its place in a cosmos far more populated and far more complex than it has yet imagined. We are inside that experiment. We may not realize it. We may not have consented to it, but the evidence suggests that we are not alone in the undertaking, and that the beings who are invested in its outcome have been invested in it longer than recorded history, with a patience that speaks of something larger than strategic interest, and with a care that witnesses across 7,000 years and every corner of the earth have reached for the same word to describe: love. The convergence. Synthesizing the evidence and the question that changes everything. We have presented 10 proofs. Let us hold them together and see what they add up to. The first proof is the testimony of the contactee wave, the dozens of ordinary men and women across multiple cultures and continents who, beginning in the early 1950s, independently reported encounters with human-appearing beings of extraordinary physical perfection, delivering messages of urgent concern about nuclear weapons and human development in ways that were multiply-witnessed, medically documented, and entirely consistent across witness accounts that preceded any cultural cross-contamination. The second proof is the ancient record, the consistent presence in the mythological and religious literature of civilizations with no historical connection to each other, of beings who match the Nordic physical description, who arrive from the sky in craft, who interact with human beings, who teach civilization, and who are associated specifically with the Pleiades and with regions of the sky that appear in the ancient record of cultures from Australia to Peru, from Mesopotamia to Scandinavia. The third proof is the Pleiadian connection, the concentration of contact accounts across both physical encounter witnesses and channeled transmission literature that specifically identify the Pleiades as the point of origin of Nordic beings, combined with the cross-cultural mythological identification of the Pleiades as the home of sky beings, and the accurate technical information transmitted through Pleiadian contact cases before that information was available through any conventional scientific source. The fourth proof is the government paper trail, the accumulation of declassified documents, internal memoranda, suppressed investigations, and credible official witness testimony that establishes the United States government and multiple other governments' knowledge of a genuine non-human phenomenon, their concealment of that knowledge from the public and from elected oversight, and the leakage, through testimony like Grusch's, of information that includes descriptions of recovered non-human biological material that is inconsistent with the gray type and consistent with the Nordic description. The fifth proof is the physical evidence, the landing trace cases analyzed by government agencies and academic institutions, the medical documentation of physiological effects on witnesses, the laboratory analysis of implants removed from contact witnesses showing isotopic ratios inconsistent with terrestrial origin, and the whispered evidence of recovered material that no official body is yet prepared to discuss openly. The sixth proof is the underground-based testimony, the convergent accounts from independent witnesses of deep program installations in which human-appearing non-human beings interact with human institutional actors in collaborative contexts, a program whose existence the full body of evidence supports, even though its precise character remains inaccessible to public examination. The seventh proof is the genetic evidence, the Rh factor distribution anomaly and its associated phenotypic clustering, the precedent of Neanderthal admixture for interbreeding between distinct biological populations, the star child and Paraka's elongated skull DNA results, and the unidentified sequences in the human genome that are inconsistent with known terrestrial biological processes. The eighth proof is the modern contact wave, the continued reporting of Nordic encounters by credible, unconditioned witnesses across cultures and continents in the post-2000 era, consistent in their physical descriptions and their emotional character and their message content with the entire historical body of Nordic encounter accounts, and increasingly characterized by a tone of urgency that suggests the timeline toward whatever threshold is coming is contracting. The ninth proof is the Nordic agenda, the reconstruction, from the behavioral patterns of the beings across the full sweep of the evidence, of a sustained, coordinated, intelligent program of observation, communication, and threshold intervention that is consistent with management, with kinship, or with evolutionary investment, and that in any of these frameworks points toward a conclusion of profound significance. Humanity's autonomous self-determination is not as autonomous as it has assumed. The 10th proof is the infiltration evidence, the witness testimony describing Nordic beings living in human society in human form, the clinical documentation of individuals with anomalous biological and cognitive characteristics consistent with non-human origin, and the historical and contemporary evidence of individuals whose exceptional capacities and sense of mission are consistent with the kind of contribution an integrated Nordic presence would produce. What do these 10 proofs, taken together, demonstrate? They demonstrate that the Nordic alien hypothesis, the proposition that physical beings of apparently non-human origin, human in appearance, and superhuman in capability, have been in sustained contact with humanity across the entire span of recorded history, is not a fringe belief, not a culturally generated fantasy, not the invention of attention-seeking fraudsters. It is the most parsimonious explanation for a body of evidence so broad, so consistent, and so deeply embedded in the documentary record of human civilization that its continued marginalization by the mainstream scientific and cultural discourse requires not evidence, but ideology. The implications of taking this evidence seriously are staggering. If Nordic beings have been interacting with humanity across thousands of years, if they contributed to the founding of our earliest civilizations, if they encoded their messages in our mythological traditions, if they have been managing the most dangerous capabilities of our technological development, if they have placed operatives within our societies, if our own genome bears traces of their biological contribution, then every assumption we hold about human history, human origins, human autonomy, and human destiny is in need of revision. The history of civilization as we have understood it, the narrative of human beings pulling themselves up from primitive beginnings through the accumulated effort of purely human intelligence and purely human endeavor, is incomplete at best. The most extraordinary leaps in human civilization, the sudden appearance of agriculture, of writing, of mathematics, of architecture, at a level of sophistication that predates the conventional timeline of technological development, may not have been the products of isolated human genius. They may have been gifts, transmissions, the result of precisely the kind of technological and intellectual transfer that the contact literature describes. Beings from a more advanced civilization contributing specific knowledge to a less advanced one at moments of particular developmental readiness. The nature of what is coming, the threshold that modern Nordic contact accounts describe with increasing urgency, is not something the evidence allows us to specify with precision. The accounts describe it in terms ranging from climate catastrophe to social collapse to a genuine quantum shift in human consciousness, and most of them describe it as some combination of all of these, operating simultaneously and interdependently. What the accounts consistently communicate is that the outcome is not predetermined, that what humanity does at this moment, what choices it makes, what values it affirms, what technologies it develops or restrains, what quality of collective attention it brings to the question of its own survival, will determine whether the coming threshold is crossed successfully or catastrophically. The Nordics have been delivering this message for 70 years in the modern era and for thousands of years in the mythological record. They have not been delivering it because they enjoy communicating. They have been delivering it because the stakes are high enough to justify a sustained investment of attention and resource and compassion, a compassion that witnesses describe as so overwhelming, so genuine, so unmistakably real, that it transforms the encounter from a strange experience into something that functions as a religious experience in the true sense, an encounter with something that is both larger than the self and genuinely concerned with the self, something that sees us not as we see ourselves, as small, confused, historically brief creatures in a vast and indifferent universe, but as something worth the trouble, something worth the investment, something worth watching over across a span of time so vast that our entire recorded history is a fraction of it. That is the final and most important implication of the 10 proofs. Not merely that we are not alone, not merely that the beings who observe us are real and physical and technologically advanced and apparently ancient, but that they are here, that they have always been here. That the universe in which humanity finds itself is not the cold, indifferent, empty place that the dominant worldview of the past 2 centuries has described. It is inhabited, it is attended. The beings who attend it are watching, and they are watching with something that witnesses, across every culture and every century, reach for the same word to name. They are watching with love. The question that changes everything is not whether this is true. The evidence makes the question of truth substantially settled. The question that changes everything is what we do with the knowledge, not governments, not institutions, not the intelligence apparatus that has spent 70 years managing public access to this reality. Human beings, individual human beings, equipped with the awareness that they are not alone, that their choices are observed, that the universe they inhabit is not silent, and that the beings who watch them believe, despite the evidence of humanity's own history, that humanity is capable of making the choices that lead to the outcome that is worth hoping for. That is the proof that matters most, not the photographs, not the declassified documents, not the genetic anomalies. The proof that matters most is the one delivered in every Nordic encounter account, consistently, across every culture, every era, every language. They keep coming back. After everything humanity has done, the wars, the destruction, the nuclear weapons, the ecological catastrophe, they keep coming back. They have not given up on us. They have not concluded that the experiment is a failure. They are still here, still watching, still trying to reach us through whatever channels are available. Still, by the evidence of every encounter account, invested in the outcome with something that looks, to every human witness who has experienced it, exactly like hope. The evidence is in. The question is ours. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.